subscribe and click the bell icon to turn on notifications.
We've made the files the instructor uses in this tutorial available for free. Just click the link below in the video details to get these.
Let's get on to what we're going to be looking at over the next hour or so. So we're going to be looking at PowerPivot and in turn something called Power Query, because these two in general, they kind of work together. So this is designed as more of an introduction to PowerPivot and Power Query. This is an absolutely enormous subject. In fact, we have training courses dedicated just to this topic. So obviously in an hour, we're not going to be going into all of the details, but what I want this session to do is really just to serve as an introduction for you. So if you've heard of the terminology PowerPivot, Power Query, but you're not really sure what they are, or maybe you've had a little play around with it and maybe finding it a little bit confusing, I hope this kind of demystifies it a little bit and really shows you the kind of things that you can do with these utilities in Excel. Now, I haven't actually done this topic for a very long time. And as I said, it is a very broad subject. But I will say, please don't worry if you've never heard of PowerPivot and Power Query. We're going to start from the beginning and explain it in full. Now, if you've never attended one of our webinars before, as always, I'll briefly introduce myself. So my name is Deborah Ashby and I'm an IT trainer and Microsoft subject matter expert, and I'm based in London in the UK, a very much locked down London at the moment. I've been training Microsoft products for about 13 years and I've been using them for about 25 years. So I've really seen it go through all of its different incantations. So hopefully that qualifies me to be running this training session for you today. Now, let's take a look at what we're going to be covering over the next hour. Now, as I said, I always like to start right at the beginning. I'm aware that we probably have very mixed abilities on the call today. I never like to assume you know anything and go straight into the more intermediate to advanced stuff. We're going to start very basic and work our way up. So the first thing we want to discuss is, what is Power Query and Power Pivot and why might it be useful to you? Now, the way that I like to explain this is to really give you a recap of just a regular pivot table. So that's the first thing we're going to do. I'm going to show you how to create a regular pivot table. So if you've never done one before, it's not going to be a mystery to you when we get to Power Pivot. So we'll go through pivot tables, a very quick reminder, and that will help explain to you the difference between just a regular pivot table and what you can do in Power Pivot. We're then going to move on to importing data into Excel from multiple different sources. I'm going to show you some of the utilities you have within Power Query to clean your data. And then we're going to get on to the main event. We're going to be creating a Power Pivot table. I'm going to show you how you can create relationships and also how you can use things like measures and KPIs, which again, maybe not something that you're particularly familiar with. And then finally at the end, we're just going to do a good old pivot chart just to remind ourselves of how we do that. So first of all, let's deal with that first item on the agenda. What is Power Query and Power Pivot? Well, both of these utilities are part of Microsoft's Power BI utilities, and I will say they are particularly useful if you're someone who needs to import, clean, and analyze large data sets from multiple different sources. And I believe Power Query and Power Pivot were first introduced in the Microsoft applications in 2010, I was reading the other day. So they've been around for quite a long while, but they have, of course, evolved as we've had more recent versions. So that's a very brief explanation as to what they are. They're great for handling large data sets from multiple different sources. Now, in order to demonstrate this, so you can really see what I mean by that statement, we're going to start out by doing just a regular pivot table. So let me jump out of my slides and I'm going to jump across to the data that we're going to be using. Hopefully you can all see that. I know sometimes there is a slight lag, so I will try and account for that as we're going through. So let's talk about regular pivot tables first of all. I have some source data on my worksheet, and if you're familiar with my webinars, you will probably be familiar with this data set. I use this all the time. And all we have here is data, or sales data, I should say, related to two different stores, Computech and Microworld, in various different parts of the UK. So you can see there we have month, we have store, town, store code, country, the manager, the category, and then we have our sales figures. Now, this is a reasonably large data set. If I jump down to the last row, and if you need to jump down to the last row in your data, if you press Control down arrow, that's going to jump you to your very last row. You can see this data set is made up of 21,574 rows. So a lot of data that we have in here. Control up arrow to jump back to the top. Now, ordinarily, what I would do is I would clean any data before I go to analyze it using a pivot table. And I cannot stress to you how important this step is. And it's a step that people tend to overlook. Before you do analysis on any type of data, you must make sure that that data is what we call clean. And there are many things that you can do within Excel to help you with cleaning your data. Now, because this session isn't about cleaning data, I've already cleaned up my data. If you are interested in learning some of those techniques, we do have a webinar available on our YouTube site, which is dedicated to cleaning data prior to analysis. So I would definitely check that out if you're not sure what I'm talking about. But some of the things you might do when you're cleaning data would be to remove any blank rows that you have in your data. Make sure that your case is consistent. So you can see here, my case is all very consistent. I don't have things that are all in uppercase or all in lowercase. You want to make sure that you've removed any duplicate entries. And again, there is a button on the data ribbon specifically related to removing duplicate entries in data sets. And you also want to make sure that you have the correct formatting applied to each column. So if I was to highlight this first column here, the month column, and go to my home ribbon, you can see in my number group, it says date. So this is formatted correctly. If I was to select column H, which contains the sales figures, you can see that that is formatted as currency. So you want to go through and make sure that all of your columns are formatted with the correct data type as well. So those are some of the things that I might do to clean up my data and make it consistent prior to analysis. The other thing that I always do, and I am a huge fan of tables, anybody who knows me knows I just love a table, is that I always put my data into a table prior to analysis. Now I'm going to show you how to do that, a little reminder in a moment, but this data is already in a table. How do I know it's in a table? Well, a few different things. I can see the formatting. It looks slightly different. I have my filters at the top here. Those get put on automatically when you put your data in a table. And also, when I'm clicked within my data, if I look up at my ribbons, you'll see that I have a Table Tools ribbon and a Design tab just here. If my data wasn't in a table, I wouldn't have access to this ribbon with all of my table tools on it. Now, another thing I always do, and again, this is an efficiency tip that I would recommend you try and get into the habit of doing throughout Excel, is that I always name my tables. So again, on this design ribbon, if you look in this first group, the properties group, you'll see where it says table name, I have TBL _ sales _ data. And that is what I have named this particular table. Now, again, it does seem a little bit tedious, but I would stress to you, always get into the habit of naming things in Excel. It's going to make your life so much easier later down the track. And for me, I like to have a naming convention. So if I'm naming tables, it will always start with TBL. So I know that this is a table. There are other things that you can name in Excel. You can name just regular ranges. So if I had numbers in this range just here that I've highlighted, I could name this range. And if it's a range, I might decide to name it RNG _ and then whatever I want. So that's how I can specify between a range and a table. So I would suggest to you, when you're naming, think about coming up with your own naming convention so it's easy for you to identify what's a table and what's a range. Phew. Now, with all that said, this table is pretty much in the perfect format to analyze in a pivot table. So let's do a quick pivot table as a reminder. I'm going to click in my table. I'm going to go up to Insert, and I'm going to say Pivot Table. And you can see here it says select a table or range. It says Table Sales Data, which is my data range. And then it's asking me, where do you want to put the new pivot table? And I'm pretty happy with New Worksheet. And I'm going to say OK. Now, if this is the first time you're ever seeing a pivot table, then this is like a 2-for-1 for you. You're going to get Power Pivot and Pivot Tables. Now, the way that pivot tables work is it basically takes that source data, and in our table fields over on the right-hand side, you can see we now have all of those column headings available to us from that source data. And I then have 4 areas down below, and I can drag and drop these different column headings into these different areas in order to display my data in a different way. So it really depends what you're trying to analyze, what you're trying to get out of your data. So I could do something very simple. So I could maybe take the, let's say, category, and I could drag it down to rows. And you can see now I have all my categories. I could take my sales data, drop it into values, and now I can see a summary of all of the sales by the different categories. And the good thing about pivot tables is that they're super flexible, so I can start to move fields around to display my data in different ways. So I could get rid of category just by dragging it out, and maybe I could switch that out for manager, and now I'm getting a summary of all the sales by manager. I could add something like town up into the filters area, which gives me this little filter at the top. So if I then wanted to zero in and see all the sales specifically for London for each manager, I can see that as well. And you can move these into different columns and do whatever you like. Okay, so that is a very basic overview of what a pivot table is. Now, it's important to understand that so that you understand how Power Pivot is different. Now, when we're doing a pivot table, all of these fields that I'm using are from one data source. So all of these fields are from this data source table up here. These are the field headings. Now, what Power Pivot allows you to do is basically import data or grab data from multiple different sources. So that could be, maybe you've got some data stored in an Access database, maybe you have it in a text file, maybe you have it in a different Excel spreadsheet. It allows you to bring all of that data into Excel and essentially create one pivot table, but utilizing fields from multiple different tables in multiple different files. Okay, so that is the main difference. So let's take a look at how that all works. Now I'm going to actually delete this because we don't need this. Let's delete that out. And I'm going to show you a few different sources of data. So I'm going to jump across to this Tables tab first of all. Now, what I have on here are essentially 4 different tables. And this last one here, I haven't formatted as a table yet because I just wanted to show you how to do that in case you weren't sure. But these first 3 are already formatted as a table. Now, what do I have in these different separate tables? I have in this first one, I have trip names. So maybe this is a travel company who offer different trips. We have the trip code. In the second table, I have the trip name and I have the activity level of that trip. In the third table, I have the, oh, that shouldn't say trip code. Sorry, let me just make a change there. I have the trip name and I have the duration of that particular trip. And then finally, I have salesperson and office. Now, these kind of essentially look fairly detached from each other. Now, what I'm going to do first of all is I'm just going to put this this data into a little table. So I'm going to click in my data. I'm going to press Control A, and that's going to highlight everything around where I'm clicked. Now, to put something into a table, the quickest way is to jump up to Format as Table. And then just to keep things consistent, I'm going to select this table style. I'm going to say my table has headers. I'm going to click on OK. So my data is now in a table and I have my Table Tools ribbon listed at the top. Now, as I said, I like to name all of my tables. So again, if you've never done this before, up to your design ribbon, over to table name, and I'm going to call this TBL because that is my preferred prefix, underscore. We're going to call this one salesperson and hit enter. Okay, so now I have 4 separate tables and I can see the names of all of these tables by clicking in that name box drop down. You can see I have all of my different tables just here. So trip code, activity level, duration, salesperson. Okay. Now, in addition to these 4 tables, I also have data in 2 separate files. So let me just pull up File Explorer. Oh, wrong one. Hang on. Here we go. So I have 2 different files here. I have sales data for 2017 and sales data for 2018. So let's just open this one here. And what you'll see in this is sales data for this travel company again. So now we have order ID, customer number, trip code, we have the trip name, we have the salesperson, we have the trip price, and then we have quantity. So I have this same data in both of these files. It's just for different years. So this is for 2017. The other file is exactly the same data, but just for 2018. So maybe some of the figures are going to be a bit different. Okay, but essentially we have the same column headings in each of those 2 files. Now, what I want to do is I want to essentially pull into Excel those 2 files, the sales data for 2017 and 2018, and also these 4 tables. And I want to utilize all of the fields in one big pivot table. So let's take a look at how we might do that. Now, we are going to be verging into Power Pivot utilities. And one thing I want to point out is that the Power Pivot ribbon, which you can see up here on mine, isn't there by default. So if you can't see Power Pivot amongst your ribbons, it's something that you need to turn on, and it is an add-in in Excel. So let me just show you where your Power Pivot add-in is. If you go to File and down to Options, and you want to go down to add-ins at the bottom. And right at the bottom where it says Manage, you need to go to COM add-ins and click on Go. And what you should see is something in there that says Power Pivot for Excel. So you probably find if you can't see it, you don't have a tick in that box. So just tick that box, click on OK, and that's going to give you your Power Pivot ribbon. Okay, so make sure that that's turned on first of all. So saying that, let's now pull in all of our different data sources into Excel. And for this, I'm just going to create a new blank workbook. All right, so in order to pull in data into your Excel worksheet, we go up to the data ribbon. Now, the first files I'm going to pull in are these 2 that I have just here. So the sales 2017 and the sales 2018. Now, I have these 2 files in this folder just here. So Power Pivot data. And because I only have these 2 files in this folder, I can essentially import this data folder in order to get these 2 files. So what I can do is I can go up to the Get and Transform data group. I'm going to go to Get Data, and this is where you can pull in data, all different sources. So it depends where you have it stored. I'm going to go to From File, and I'm going to say From Folder. And it's now asking me for my folder path. So I'm going to click on Browse. And I'm now going to navigate to that data folder where those 2 files are. So please bear with me. I have a lot of files. So let's just jump through. And we want to find Power Pivot. There we go. And we have a data folder. There it is. I'm going to select it, click on OK, and click on OK again. And it goes away, and it's now pulling in those 2 files. Now, once it's done it, it's going to list both of those files. You can see the name, Sales 2017, Sales 2018. And I then have some options at the bottom as to what I want to do next with this data. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, because these two files are pretty much exactly the same, they just have slightly different figures in them, all of the column headings are the same, I'm going to combine them together in one big file. So I'm going to click the Combine drop down and I'm going to say Combine and Transform Data. And again, this can take a couple of minutes, or sorry, a couple of seconds, I should say. And there we go. So it's pulled those two files through. And at the moment, it's giving me a little preview of just this first file. And you can see both of the files listed up there. It's saying the first file is 2017, and it's showing me a preview of the first 200 rows of that particular file. So really it just kind of shows you what it's going to look like when it pulls it into Excel. That all looks pretty good to me. I'm going to click on OK. And again, this can take a couple of seconds. And what will happen is, because I selected to combine and transform, it takes me into the Power Query editor. Now, when we say transform, what we mean is essentially cleaning your data. You can make changes to your data from within Power Query. So this is another great thing. Instead of cleaning up your data prior to pulling it in, you can pull it in, open it in Power Query, and then utilize the Power Query utilities to clean up your data, make changes to your data. So my data is now in one big file. It's combined the two of them together. And there are so many different options in here. Again, I'm not going to go through all of them, but I will show you a couple that I think are important. On this transform ribbon up here, there's lots of different utilities that you can use to make changes to your data and essentially clean it up. So, for example, if I click on Format, you can see here we have some of those options for changing the case. So if I had this salesperson column, maybe everything was in uppercase and I wanted to change it to lowercase, or what we call proper case, which is what I have here, I could select that column, go to Format, and I can change it using these utilities in here. Trim as well is another one that will trim off any blank spaces, erroneous blank spaces that you have in your data. Again, these are functions in Excel that you could use prior to pulling it in, but you do have these features within Power Query. So it really just helps you clean and tidy your data prior to analysis. Okay. Now, a couple of things that I'm going to do with my data. As I said, my data was clean before I brought it in, so I'm not going to have to utilize too many of these utilities. However, I can see some things in here that I don't necessarily want to analyze. So, for example, it pulls in the source name. So this is just telling me the file name of this data. Now, I'm not going to want to use this in my analysis, so I'm going to remove this entire column. So if I go to the Home ribbon, I have a Remove Columns option, and I'm going to say Remove Column because that one's not really needed. If I look across, I can also see my quantity column here. Now, pretty much everybody in my data has just purchased one trip. So again, I don't particularly need this column because it just says one in every single row. So again, I'm just going to remove that column as well. So now I'm left with the order ID, customer number, trip code, trip, salesperson, and trip price. Now, as I said, lots of other formatting things that you could do here. Another example would be for trip price. You could go to transform and you have options for rounding as well. So you can round up, round down, so on and so forth. Now, something that's super important to do when you're in here is to check to make sure you have the correct data type selected for each column. So again, your data type is listed just here. So you have this little icon, and if you click it, it allows you to select the data type of the data within that column. So I can see here that this has correctly selected that this is a whole number. That's fine. And I think pretty much all of mine are okay. But just so you know, this one here, it says ABC. That means that it is text, which is fine. This one is also text. This one is text. And this one. And then finally, it's showing me that this is currency being displayed in this column. So if you do have something a little bit strange up there, make sure you go in and select the correct data type for your column. Now, something else that we have in this Power Query editor is if you look over on the right-hand side, you can see we have our properties, and my data is just named data. And I'm actually going to change that. I'm just going to click at the start there, and I'm just going to say sales data. And then underneath that, we have our applied steps. Now, this is a great way of tracking what you're doing in Power Query. So you can see here, the last thing I did was I removed 2 columns. So if I wanted to backtrack out of that, and maybe I decide that I want those columns back, you could kind of backtrack through your steps just here. So I could click on the cross, and that will essentially undo what I did. So I now have my columns back. Okay, now I don't want them there, so I'm going to go back in and just remove those columns. And the same for this one again. Okay, so this Power Query editor is really a way just to tidy up your data. Now, once you've got your data into a format that you think is fine, what we then need to do is we then need to load it into Excel. So remember, this is kind of an amalgamation of those 2 files. They've been put together in one big file. So all you need to do is go up to the Home ribbon, click the drop down and say Close and Load To. And again, this can take a few seconds depending on how large your data set is. So let's all keep our fingers crossed that this doesn't crash, because if it's going to crash at any point, it's normally this point. Hooray, we've been successful. So now it's saying to me, import data. And it's asking me, what do I want to import this data into? So I could choose to create a pivot table straight away or a pivot chart. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to say only create connection. And I'm going to say add this to the data model. Now you might think, why on earth am I doing that? What this actually does is it creates just a link to your data. It doesn't essentially import it into Excel. And this is why it's so good for large data sets. Imagine if you had a data set of 60 million rows and you decide to import all of that into Excel straight into a pivot table. Your pivot table probably isn't going to be able to cope with that much data. You're going to find problems with Excel. You might find it crashing, all those kinds of things. Whereas if you just create a link or a connection to your data, it's not essentially sitting in your Excel worksheet. And this is why it's amazing for extremely large data sets. So I'm going to say create a connection and add this data to the data model. So let me say OK. And you'll see I get this little pane pop up at the side. And it's loading my data. You can see at the bottom there, it says sales data. I'm just going to collapse this up so you can see a bit better. It says 498 rows loaded. So I don't have an enormous data set just here. But if I hover over, that is my data set that I've just been looking at. It's not been imported into Excel, but I have a connection to it so I can access it. So that's my first data set, a combination of those 2 files that I've imported in as a connection. But there are other files or other tables that I want to pull in as well. If you remember, if we jump back to our Power Pivot workbook just here, I have these 4 additional tables. And I want to pull all of these into Excel as well. So I'm going to close this down and I'm going to say, let's say save. And I'm now going to import those 4 tables into here as well. So I'm going to go back up to data. I'm going to go to get data and I'm going to say from file. Now these 4 tables are located in an Excel workbook. So I'm going to say from workbook. I now need to find that workbook. So again, just bear with me while I go through my millions of files. Where are we? Power Pivot. And there it is. It's this one here, Power Pivot Workbook 2. And I'm going to say import. And again, we might have to wait a couple of seconds. But what it will do is it will scan that entire workbook and it will show me all of the tables that I have within that workbook. And it might be that I want to import all of them or maybe just a select few. And if you click on each one, it's going to show you in the preview what that is. So that is one of the tables that I want to import. Table and the duration. Now, sales data is my original file. Now, I don't actually want to import that one. I just want those 4 smaller tables on the other page. So the ones I want are, I'm just going to click select multiple items, activity level, duration, salesperson, and trip code. Those are my 4 little tables. I'm going to go to the bottom and I'm going to say load to. And again, it pops up this little import data dialog box, and it's already selected for me, only create connection and add this to the data model. So what we're building up over here in the right-hand pane is essentially our data model. It just means we're bringing in all of the data we want to use. So I'm going to say OK. And what you should see now happen in that right-hand pane is I have all of those tables are now loading. So it's pulling all of that data in. And again, these aren't particularly large tables. You can see 19 rows, 6 rows, so on and so forth. So now I have all of my data sources from different sources. So I have my first one is 2 files, which I brought in from a particular folder. And then I have just some tables from an Excel workbook. And you could carry on doing this. So if you had more data, maybe in some kind of Access database, you could pull that in. If you've got it stored in SharePoint, something like that. Okay, so you can pull in as much as you like into here. Now, once you have all of the data that you want to use loaded, you can then start to build your pivot table. So I'm going to select my sales data. I'm going to go up to insert and I'm going to say pivot table. Now, when I get my create pivot table dialog box this time, I'm going to select a slightly different option to what I normally would. So you can see it's already selected it for me. It's recognized that we have a data model, which is our tables over here. So it's selected, use this workbook's data model for the pivot table, which is great. And it's saying, where do you want me to put this pivot table? And I'm going to say existing worksheet and click on OK. So now we get this. Now I'm going to close down this queries and connections pane because we don't need that at the moment. But can you see the difference over here from what we had before? Now we have all of our sales data, and if I expand that, I can see all of those field headings, but I also have access to those individual smaller tables. So table activity with the 2 fields, table duration, I have those 2 fields, salesperson, and then trip code. So essentially what I can now do is utilize any of these fields in one pivot table. And that is the difference between a pivot table where you're just using one source of data and a Power Pivot table where you're utilizing lots and lots of different sources of data. Hopefully that makes that quite clear. All right, so let's do some dragging and dropping around. Now, I seem to have put my pivot table in the middle of the worksheet here, which is fine, but I would normally prefer to have it in cell A1, but I was obviously clicked in the middle of my worksheet when I was doing this. So let's just do something really basic first of all. I'm going to go up to my sales data. So this is my main table here. I'm going to grab, let's grab the trip field, and I'm going to drag it down to rows. And you can see my trips are now listed in my rows. I'm going to take the trip price field and I'm going to drag that down into values. So essentially now I can see the sum of the trip price by the trip name. Now this is absolutely fine because both of these fields that I've utilized are essentially from the same table of data, the sales data table. So I'm never going to have any problems with that. But what if I want to now add in the activity level, which is from a completely different table of data? Let's see what happens. I'm going to add the activity level into this filters area. Now it's put it there at the top, but if I click the drop down and I want to sort my data by all of the active trips, if I click active and click on OK, it doesn't actually work. It doesn't filter anything. And you can see here in that right-hand pane, it says relationships between tables may be needed. So there is actually, at the moment, there is no relationship that's been established between this activity level table and the main table. So nothing links together. Hence why when I'm changing up here, nothing is happening with the data below. So you need to create relationships between your tables. And this is where we utilize our Power Pivot ribbon. So what am I doing here? Let's have a look. I am wanting to use the activity level, and I want to essentially link it to this table up here, this first main data table. So I'm going to jump in to the Manage Data Model button. Now, this opens up a different window entirely, our Power Pivot for Excel window. And what this will show you is at the bottom, we have all of our different tables of data that we're using. So we have our main sales data table. I can click on activity level to see that one, duration, salesperson, and trip code. So I have all of my data loaded at the bottom. Now, what I'm really interested in here is getting an overview of those relationships and seeing how I can link tables together. And by far, at least I find, the easiest way to do this is to go straight up to the home ribbon and jump into Diagram View. So let's click that button. Now, what this does is it shows you all of your tables in more of a graphical representation. And you can move these around. And in general, I will tend to do that. So I like to have my smaller tables. So these ones here, which have the fewest fields, down at the bottom. And then I tend to put my main table above them. So what we want to do here is we want to create links so that it can pull through the correct information. Now, what we were trying to do is we were trying to filter by activity level. So looking at this activity level table down here, you might think that I want to create a relationship between the activity level field and something up here in the sales data. But that's not actually what you want to do. What you want to do is you want to find the field in the table activity level that corresponds to the field in the sales data table. So you're looking for the key, the thing that links these two tables. Now, if I look for the field activity level up here, I don't have an activity level field in this data. However, I do have a trip field, and I also have a trip field down here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to link this trip field in the table activity level to the trip field in the sales data table. That will essentially link these two and allow me to access this information in activity level. And the way that you create a relationship or a link is very simple, and you always link from the smaller to the main table. So I'm going to click on trip, and I'm just going to drag it and link it to trip up in this main sales data table. And again, this can take a few seconds, but it creates a link between these two fields. And you can see here, if it's green, it shows you that that is a valid link. And we link from the smaller to the larger. This is called a one-to-many link, okay? So now that I've linked the trip field in sales data and the trip field in activity level, if I minimize this down, you can see now that that big yellow message, which was warning us that we didn't have a relationship, has now disappeared. And if I click my activity level and change it to active, okay, it's now filtering correctly because there is a link there. It's linked, the trip field between the two tables is linked together, which enables me to pull through any other fields in there. It's kind of similar to a VLOOKUP in many different ways. Hopefully that makes sense. I know this is quite difficult to get your head around if you're very new to it. Now, let's do this again. So I am going to, let's remove activity level, like so. And what I might want to do is I'm going to remove, let's remove trip from here as well. And this time I'm using the trip price in values. I'm going to go to a different table at the bottom, and I'm going to use this trip just here. I'm going to drag that down to rows. Now again, I'm getting this yellow message because there is no connection or no relationship between this table and the main data table. So I need to go back to my diagram and I need to set up that relationship. So again, I've used the trip code. Sorry, let me minimize that. I don't think I used the trip code. I've used the trip in the trip code table. So let's go to the trip code table. I'm going to grab trip and I'm going to link it to trip up here. Again, if I minimize down, you can now see that yellow message has disappeared, and I can now go through and utilize that because I've created a link between those two tables. So this is how you set up relationships. Now, you could carry on going through doing this ad hoc. So you could start moving your fields around. Whenever you get that yellow message, you can go in. Alternatively, you could do it at the beginning. So you could go through and link everything to this main table first of all. So if I'm to go through these, I have my activity level linked. That's fine. What about this one? Table duration. So if I want to use the duration field, if I look in my main table at the top, I have no duration field. But what is the common field between the two tables? Again, it's trip. So I'm going to link this trip to trip. And then in my salesperson table, if I want to pull through the office field or utilize the office field, again, I don't have the office field in my main data, but I do have salesperson. So I can select and link it to that. So essentially, I now have all of my smaller tables linked via the common field in this diagram. So when I minimize this down, I now should then be able to move things around and organize everything as I want without getting any errors. So let's remove trip from rows. And this time I am going to select, let's say salesperson. I'm going to drag that to rows. And maybe I want to utilize the office field. And because we've linked the salesperson, this should work fine. I'm going to add that to filters, and it does. I'm not getting any error. So I could now filter by office, and I'm going to say Cardiff. Let's select multiple, Chicago, Hamburg. And there we go. Everything is working nicely. So that is how you can pull in data from loads of different sources, link the tables together so you can then utilize all of those different field headings in essentially one pivot table. Hopefully that makes sense to everyone. Now I'm going to drag our office. And I'm just going to stick with these, this data here. So I have my salespeople listed, and I have the amount in dollars of trips that they've sold. Now I'm going to show you a couple of little things here. These aren't necessarily related specifically to PowerPivot. These are pivot table things that you can do, but I think these are also really very useful. Now, what I might want to do here is currently this isn't sorted in any particular order. So what I could do is I could right click, I could say sort, and I'm going to say largest to smallest. So I can now see that Ben is the salesperson who has sold the most in monetary terms, sold the most trips essentially. Now, what if I wanted to maybe get a number of trips that each salesperson has sold? Well, what I can do is I can drag another trip price field down to here. So essentially, I'm dragging another one of these. So I'm going to say trip price. I'm going to drag it down underneath. And it creates another column. Now, it's exactly the same because it's the same field. It's just giving me the sum of trip price, and it's called it sum of trip price 2. But what I could do here is if I wanted to see the number of trips each person has sold, I can go down to my values area, and where I have sum of trip price 2, if I click that drop down, I can go to value field settings, And I'm going to change this name to trips sold. Oops. This time I'm going to say do a count instead of a sum and click on OK. So now I can see who has sold the most trips. And I can see currently that is still Adam. It doesn't seem to have taken my price, my title there. Let me just go back in. Hang on a second. Oh, I did that. Let me just do trips sold again. There we go. Okay, so now I can see that Adam is way out ahead here with the number of trips sold. So despite the fact that Ben had sold the most in monetary terms, Adam has actually sold the most trips. Well done, Adam, is what I say. Now, something else that we might want to do here is we might want to find out the average price per trip. So who is selling the most on average each time they make a sale? So again, I'm going to grab trip price. I'm going to drag it down to values. And this time, if I click the little drop down and go to value field settings, I can select average. And I'm going to change this to say just average, like so. And click on OK. So now I get something completely different. And again, I could go in, I could right click, I could sort largest to smallest. So now I can see that even though Ben sold the most in monetary terms and Adam sold the most as in how many trips, Vicky is actually the person who's averaging the best per trip sold. So I'm getting all kinds of different ways of looking at my data. So utilizing things like this by dragging the same field down and just changing the data you're displaying allows you to see information that you didn't necessarily have in the source data that you used for your pivot table. So it's a great way of doing things like that. Now, the reason I wanted to show you that is because I wanted to go into the Power Pivot tools, the measures tool, which will help you do something fairly similar. So I'm going to remove this average field. And I'm going to drag it out of values just to get rid of that. Now I could do an average in a slightly different way. So I'm going to go up to Power Pivot, and you can see here on the Power Pivot ribbon, I have something called measures. I'm going to click the drop down and I'm going to say I want to add a new measure. So it's asking me, this is basically going to set a measure up as an additional field in my Power Pivot table. So it's saying to me, where do you want me to add this field? Now I'm happy for it to be added into the sales data table, which is the main one at the top. I'm going to call my measure average. And then what I could do is I could use this measure to work out what the average sales are. So you can see here in this box, it says formula, and I have an equals sign. So if I press the square bracket on my keyboard, it automatically brings up some things that I could do. So if I want to work out the average, I'm essentially going to do the sum of the trip price divided by the number of trips. So I'm going to say sum of trip divided by, if I do a square bracket again, count of trip. I want it to format it as currency. I'm happy with it to stay on US dollars with 2 decimal places. And I'm going to say, OK. And there we go. So it does something very similar, but it's set it up as a measure instead through Power Pivot. Now, something else you might want to do is once you've got this average, and there are all different kinds of calculations you can do, and that's why these measures are great. You can add as many measures as you like. And that is definitely something, if you think this might be useful to you, something for you to read further about, all the different ways that you can utilize measures. But now something else I might want to do here is I might want to measure the key performance indicators. So I'm going to jump up to KPIs. And I'm going to say I want to add a new KPI. And this takes me into here. So it's telling me I want this KPI based on the average column. So it's going to base it on these average figures. And maybe what I want to see is I want a visual indicator. So you can see these icon styles I have at the bottom, a visual indicator that tells me who is on target, who is just about right, and who is below target. So what I can do here is I can define my values. So looking at my data in this average column, they're all fairly sort of similar, but I'm going to say that my target is 2,100. If you look at this threshold bar below, you can see it's put that target just there, that little line. And what I can now do is drag these up. So I'm going to say if somebody reaches 2,100 average sales, then they're doing amazing. They're going to get a green icon to show that they're doing amazing. And then I can specify the lower threshold. Now, all of mine are fairly close together. So in order to get this to demonstrate correctly for you, I'm going to drag this all the way up to 1,900 because I only have one person, that is Adam, who is averaging underneath 1,900. So you can set your thresholds however you want. You can then select your icon styles. I'm going to keep it on this little traffic light system. I'm going to say, OK. And what it gives you is another column that says average status. Now, you might be a bit confused as to why you're not getting your indicators. You're getting these strange numbers for some reason. And if somebody knows, you can explain this to me. But what you need to do is go back into your pivot table fields and find your average indicator just here. So I'm going to expand it. You can see it has a tick in the status field. If you just remove it, and then put it back in again, it gives you your indicators. So I can now see as a visual representation who is below target, so that is Adam, unfortunately, who is sort of on target, so that might be Deborah, Drew, and who is above target, who is exceeding the target, so Ben, Brooke, and Vicky. And again, that is just one KPI. There are so many different measures, KPIs that you can add in. But again, it just helps you visualize your data and see your data a little bit clearer. So having said all of that, I just want to finish off with just doing a very, very basic pivot chart in case we've all forgotten how to do a pivot chart. Now I'm going to remove some of these fields because I have quite a few now down here. I'm going to get rid of average status. Let's get rid of all of these and just go back to our very basic salesperson and the amount of trips that they've sold. So just as a very brief reminder, if we want to convert this data into a chart, we click in our pivot table. We can go up to our pivot table tools, go to the Analyze ribbon and select our pivot chart option. And there we have all of the different charts. There are so many of them for you to choose. I'm going to do a basic column chart, click on OK, and there we have that data represented as a column chart. And remember, when you are utilizing pivot charts, you have 3 additional ribbons at the top to help you organize, manage, and format your pivot charts. So some things that I might want to do on this pivot chart. This is a very basic one, but I don't really need these little gray filter buttons. So I'm going to get rid of them. I'm going to right click and I'm going to say hide all fill buttons on chart. I don't really need this legend either because all I'm displaying here is I just need to see the salesperson and how much they've sold. So I don't really need this legend. So it is a text box. I can just delete it out. And that gives me a little bit more room. And I could add a title if I wanted to, which might be something along the lines of sales by salesperson. And of course, there's a whole host of different formatting options when it comes to charts. I could add some labels, axis labels down here by clicking the plus. I can add things like axis titles and chart titles, data labels, so on and so forth. So much you can do when it comes to formatting charts. Whew. We've got about 4 minutes left. Hopefully, I know that's just a very brief introduction, but hopefully what that has shown you is the potential that you have when it comes to bringing in data from lots of different sources and particularly very large data sets. Because it's not crammed into your Excel file, you're not going to have any worries about your Excel file crashing because you've just created a link to the data as opposed to pulling it in. And then you can mix and match and utilize fields from multiple different tables in one pivot table, as long as you've created those relationships. Our webinars normally run for roughly an hour. I think we might get away a little bit earlier this evening because there isn't as much content in this one as in our normal webinars. But I think you're going to find it really useful, particularly if you do the kind of roles where you might be asked to do some basic forecasting. Now, I know we've probably got a lot of our regulars on today, but for anyone who's joining us or is new to our webinars, I'll just very briefly introduce myself. So my name's Deborah Ashby, and I'm a freelance IT trainer, and I specialize in Microsoft products. So my job basically involves the design, delivery, and facilitation of Microsoft training and courses, both online and in the classroom. And I've been using Excel for a very, very long time, since about 1995. Makes me feel very, very old. But the thing I love about it most is that it's always changing. So there's always new stuff to learn. And we're going to focus on some of that newer stuff today as we get into talking about forecasting in Excel. So let's take a look at what we're going to cover. Now, this is a basic forecasting session. We could go a lot deeper into this. There is quite a lot to forecasting once you get into it, but I'm going to take it from the standpoint that you're completely new to forecasting, and we're going to start from the beginning. So I'll run through with you just some basics of what exactly forecasting is. I'm going to show you a couple of different types of forecasting that we're going to be exploring in the session today. I'm going to show you how to do some forecasting using a couple of functions which I'm going to guess you've probably never used before, slope and intercept. So that's quite exciting. There is a little bit of maths. I'm just warning you now, you're going to feel like you're back at school in the beginning part because we are going to do a little bit of maths. We're then going to move on to the easier way of forecasting, which is using Excel's inbuilt forecast functions, and the main one being FORECAST.LINEAR. I'm going to show you how you can incorporate using named ranges to make your forecasting just a little bit more efficient. I'm going to show you another way to forecast using another Excel function, the trend function, and we're going to throw in with that some array functions. Again, if you're not sure what I mean by that, I'm going to explain all of this when we get to it. And then finally, we're going to use forecast sheets, or what we like to call one-click forecasting. It's not technically one click, it's a couple of clicks, but it is a lot quicker if you're just trying to get a very basic forecast. So it's a really nice little utility that's fairly new to Excel. So I'll show you how all of that works as well. And of course, we couldn't do forecasting without throwing in some charts somewhere in the mix. So we're going to be taking a look at a couple of charts where we can see a forecast and also trend lines and things like that. So hopefully that's what you were expecting from the session today. As I said, I'm going to try and keep it reasonably basic, but hopefully interesting. So let's start out with that first question. What is forecasting? Well, really, forecasting is just predicting future values based on historical values and trends. So if you can imagine, it might be that you work in a sales team and you've got data, your sales data for the last 3 years, and you want to use that to predict what your sales are going to be for next year. That would be what we consider forecasting. Or it might be that maybe you want to work out what stock prices are going to do over the next 3 months based on what they've done in the previous year or 2 years, something along those lines. Or in a situation like meteorology, the weather, we all look at the weather forecast. That's based on trying to predict what the weather is going to do. Now, that incorporates data and lots of other different kinds of factors as well. And one thing I will say to you is if you are forecasting data, don't take it as an exact science. It is definitely not an exact science. Forecasting is very much kind of doing a best guess based on the data that's gone before it. Okay, so it can give you a good idea of what your sales are going to look like in the future based on what has gone before. Now, as I said, we're going to use many different techniques to look at forecasting in Excel, but this is just kind of a little example, and we're actually going to recreate this example. You can see here we have some dates. I have some sales figures in columns A and B, and then right at the bottom, you can see that I've forecasted what those sales might look like based on what has gone previously. And I've also got a little chart on there, a line chart, which is showing me that forecast. The forecast is shown in orange, and it's also showing me a confidence level. Now, I'm going to get into exactly what that is when we come to create this little chart, but that's kind of what it looks like once you've set it up. Now, when it comes to forecast functions in Excel, there are two main ones that you're probably going to utilize most frequently. The first one is FORECAST.LINEAR. Now, I've got a little description under there, and I am very well aware that just explaining it or saying this description doesn't really give you an idea of what it does. So we are going to jump into an example in a moment. But basically, this function predicts a Y value, so something like sales, for a given X value. So that might be a date. And what you need to do is provide the known Ys, so the known sales, and also the known X's, which might be the known dates, in order to get your forecast using the FORECAST.LINEAR function. The other one that you might see in use, which is fairly common, is forecast. I've put EPS there, it's ETS. I'm sorry, I've made a typo there. It stands for exponential triple smoothing. And this is a way of forecasting which also incorporates other information. So it does things like estimates trends, it estimates seasonality, and it gives the most weight to the most recent data point. So it is a little bit different to the linear forecast. Now, you might think, well, okay, that doesn't really make too much sense. So what we're going to do is we're going to jump into examples where hopefully it will all become a little bit clearer. So let's jump across to our Excel spreadsheet. So this is the spreadsheet that's been dropped into the chat pane. So if you have it open, please feel free to follow along with me. Now, the first thing that's really important to point out here is the version of Excel that I'm using. So I'm using the latest version of Excel, which is, I have Microsoft 365 or Office 365, which is always constantly updated. Now, the reason why I'm saying this is because some of the functions aren't available in versions older than 2016. So if you're using 2016, 2019, or Microsoft 365, you're probably going to have all of the functions I'm going to show you. If you're on something older, you may not. Now, a good way to check before we get going is if in a cell you just type in forecast, that's going to show you all of the forecast functions that you have available. So that's a nice quick way of checking to see what you have. Now, we've got quite a few in there. We're really going to focus on forecast.linear. Now, you'll also see at the bottom, I have a forecast function, but it has a little warning symbol next to it. Now, if you see that, basically forecast is the old function in Excel, which has now been replaced with forecast.linear. Okay, so forecast.linear and forecast are essentially the same thing. And depending on which version of Excel you're using, you may see forecast.linear or forecast. Okay, so that's just a good one to check to make sure that you're using a similar version so that you don't get confused as we go through this session. All right, now let's delete that out. Now, what we're going to start out with, I'm going to move on to those forecast functions in the next exercise. What I want to start with is using two functions called slope and intercept. Now, you may never have used these before or never have heard of them, but they are functions that you can use to do forecasting. So, for example, I've tried to make this really simple. We've got some X values here and we have some Y values. And my X values are just 1 to 12. And then I have some Y values listed just here. Now, my X values are just moving up by 1 every time. And if it helps you to understand this a little bit better, you could maybe think about these as maybe months of the year. And my Y values, maybe you want to think of those as maybe some sales figures. So these don't have any particular pattern in the way that they're increasing. There's no standard. It's not increasing by 2 every time. It's not increasing by 5. It varies, okay? Now, what I want to do here is essentially, when X is 13, I want Excel to tell me what the Y value is going to be. And we can do that by essentially forecasting it using the slope and intercept functions. Now, what we're trying to do here when we're forecasting is, if you imagine this on a chart and you've got a trend line running through, we're trying to kind of calculate a straight line. We want the straightest line through this data in order to predict our next number. And what we're going to do here is we're going to utilize a little equation. And this is what I mean. This is going to take you back to maths class. I didn't even remember this from maths class, but you might. We're going to look at the equation for a straight line, which is y equals mx plus c. Now, the reason I'm showing you this, there is a much easier way to do this forecasting for me to get this value. But the reason I'm showing you this is so you start to understand what forecasting is kind of doing in the background of Excel. So this is our equation for a straight line. Now, we've got y here. We know our y values, so we know what they are. We have our x values, so we know what x is in this equation. But the two unknowns are m and also c, okay? So in order to construct our little formula down here using slope and intercept, we need to work out what m and c are going to be. So for m, we're going to use a slope function. Now, if you've never used slope before, all it does is it returns the slope of a regression line. So if you can imagine, again, a trend line, slope calculates the slope essentially of that regression line. So I'm going to say equals slope, open bracket. Now, the arguments that we have for this function are really, really straightforward. You can see here it's asking, what are the known y values? And this is why I've headed these x and y to make this a little bit easier for you to understand. So our known y's, we just select them. This is the data that we know, essentially. Comma. Then it asks for the known x's. So we just select our known x's. Close the bracket, hit enter. That gives us our slope value. So we're going to plug that into our formula, which we're going to use down here in a moment. The final thing we need to work out is this c value. And this is using a function called intercept. Now, intercept function returns the y-axis intersection. Okay, now you may not understand that too much, but if you can imagine, again, a trend line. So I'm going to say intercept. And again, it's the same argument. So it wants to know the known y's, comma, and then the known x's. Close my bracket, hit enter, and it gives me a figure. So I can now utilize these to create essentially a little formula down here that's going to tell me what the forecast is if x is 13. And I'm going to use this little equation for a straight line. So what we're going to say is equals, now we're looking for y, so we want m first of all. So our m value is G7. Now, if I want to drag this down for more x values, I want to make sure that I lock this or make it absolute by pressing F4. We're then going to do multiplied by x, which is this value just here. We don't need to lock that one. And then we're going to do plus, and we want the value of c, which is this here, that intercept value. And again, if I'm going to drag this formula down, I want to make sure that I make that absolute as well. And hit enter. And it gives me my forecast essentially. So now if I was to add more values for x, so let's add down to 17, I can now drag this formula down or double click to autofill it down. And there is my forecasted values when the value is x is 13, 14, 15, so on and so forth. Okay, so that is a way that you can do a forecast using slope and intercept. Now, I will say the functions I'm going to show you in a moment don't require you to do all of this. They're a lot easier. But I like to show you that just to give you an alternative if you're using a version where maybe you don't have the forecast functions, but you do have slope and intercept. It's always good. But also to help you understand exactly what you're doing here. You're sort of trying to work out a straight line through your data as best as you can. And these are the two functions that can help you with that. All right. Let's move on to doing it a simpler way using Excel's forecast functions. So let's jump across to our next worksheet, FORECAST.LINEAR. So again, I have the same values in here. We have our X values, we have our Y, and I want to work out what Y is, but this time I'm going to use a forecast function. Now, if you're wondering where these forecast functions are kept in Excel, you'll find them on the formulas ribbon, and they actually come under this more functions area. They're under statistical. Okay, so you'll find all of your forecasting is located in here. So here are all the forecast functions. You'll also find in here intercept, which we just used, and also slope as well. Okay, so they're part of the statistical functions group in Excel. So we're going to use our forecast function. Now I'm actually going to do this up in the formula bar as opposed to typing it directly in the cell, because I find that the formula I'm typing covers up a cell that I need to click on. So I'm going to click up in the formula bar. We're going to type in equals. I'm going to start to type in forecast, and I'm going to use FORECAST.LINEAR. Remember, if you don't have that and you only have forecast, that's fine. It's the same thing. Now again, we've got our arguments here. So we've got three arguments. We've got X, known Ys, and known X's. So these are reasonably straightforward arguments for us to work out. So the first thing it wants is the X value. So for this one, that's cell C17. Comma. Known Ys, again, we're just inputting all of the Ys that we know. Comma, known X's, like so. And then I can close my bracket and hit enter, and it's going to give me the same thing. Okay, so I'm pretty much getting the same results as when I use that slope and intercept, but that forecast.linear is a lot easier because you don't have to really work out the equation or anything along those lines. Okay, hopefully that's reasonably straightforward so far. Let's move on to our next example. Now with this one, I've removed X and Y, and we've got date and sales. I've just put X and Y at the top there, just as a little reminder, simply because when you're using the function, it says known X's, known Y's. Sometimes if you get confused, it's a bit easier just to put X and Y at the top. You can always delete them later, just to remind you as which column is which. So this might be this is sales data. So essentially, and for my people joining us today in the UK, you'll notice that these are actually in American format, the dates. So in the UK, we write the date backwards, or maybe you guys write the date backwards. I don't know which one it is, but these are in the American format. So I'm basically taking a reading of my sales data on the 1st of every month. So we have a reading on January the 1st, a reading on February the 1st, so on and so forth. So these sales figures are essentially for the month before. So if I'm taking a reading on January the 1st, these are essentially going to be the sales figures for December 2017, so on and so forth. And what can I see by looking at this data? Well, I can see that it goes all the way down to June 2019. And I can just, by looking at these figures, I can see that roughly sales are increasing as the months pass. So maybe what I want to do is work out what the sales are going to look like for the next 3 months. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit so we've got a little bit more room. And I've got X and Y listed at the top here, and again, we can use our forecast.linear function. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this in a slightly different way and show you how you can make it a little bit easier using named ranges. So first of all, I'm going to add in the dates. So I'm just going to drag this down. Let's do it let's do it for the next 3 months. I want to work out the sales figures for July, August, and September. Now, before I start to construct my forecast, I'm going to name my known X and Y's. So I'm going to grab and drag down, and in the name box over here, I'm going to call this known underscore Y's. Now, you can call these whatever you like. You might just want to call them sales. That's fine. Hit enter, and I'm going to do the same for the dates just here, and I'm just going to call those known underscore X's and hit enter. So now when I'm constructing my forecast function, it's a little bit easier because I can use the named ranges as opposed to having to select the cells every single time. So again, we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to type in forecast and we're going to select forecast.linear. The value of X, well, it's going to be this one here, C23, comma. It now wants the known Y's. So instead of selecting these, I can utilize my named ranges. Now, when you set up named ranges in Excel, a quick way to pull up all of your named ranges is to press the F3 key on your keyboard, and any named ranges you have will show in here. Okay? So I need to select, I can't remember which one it was now, known Y's, that's it. Let me pull those again. Known Y's, that's my range. Comma. I can now press F3 again, and I can utilize my known X's named range. And as I said again, you didn't have to call them that. You could call them sales and date to make it a little bit easier to read. Close my bracket, enter, and I get my result. And again, I can double click to autofill that down. And very quickly, I've managed to predict what my sales are going to be for the next 3 months. Hopefully that's making sense to everyone so far. So reasonably simple. Now, I will say with these forecast functions, again, if I type this in, you can see that there's lots of them in there. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, what do all of these other ones do? And I would advise you to, have a little play around with them, see the differences that you get when you use each one of these. If you want to know a little bit more information about exactly what each of them do, I would always advise you to check the help file. So if I go up to at the top here in Excel, I have this little search bar. I'm just going to type in forecast. And you'll see right at the bottom, it says get help on forecast. And this can sometimes be really, really useful because it's going to pop open that help screen and it's going to show you all of the different types of forecast function. You can click on them and then you can read up exactly what that does. You might find that for the data that you're using, you might find that forecast.ets is more relevant for the type of data that you use if you have seasonal data, things like that. So I always advise people to jump across to help to check out the details of each of them. So we've dipped our toe into slope and intercept, 2 new functions. We've also had a look at forecast.linear, and we've seen how we can utilize named ranges when we're doing our forecast to make it a little bit more efficient and easier to read. I'm going to show you one more way which you can forecast, and that is by using the trend function. Now, again, this might be a function that you have never used before. And when you're using the trend function, we need to use this as an array function or an array formula. Now, if you're not familiar with what arrays are, I'm going to go off on a tangent, first of all, just to show you what an array formula is, so you understand it when we use it when we're doing our trend forecasting. So I have another little spreadsheet here, which is completely unrelated to what we're doing, but it's just a really nice, simple way of explaining to you what an array formula actually is. At its core, an array formula allows you to perform multiple calculations all at once. And it looks very similar to a regular formula, but the main difference being is that instead of pressing Enter to confirm your formula, you press Control-Shift-Enter. That makes it an array formula. So you might still be thinking, well, okay, what exactly does it do? Well, let me just show you very briefly here. I've got a little table here. We've got some products, just some basic fruits. We have the amount sold, we have the price, and then we have the total. And you'll see here the total is calculated D5 multiplied by E5. So we're essentially multiplying the amount sold by the price in order to get this total. We then have, so we've worked out all of those totals, and then right at the bottom, we have essentially a grand total, which is summing all of these. Now, what I could have done here, instead of going to the effort of creating this formula, D5 multiplied by E5, copying it down, and then doing this formula, I could have got the total of 810 all in one go by using an array formula. Okay, so let me just show you how that would work. If I was to type equals sum, open bracket, what I could do is say, highlight the entire range, D5 to D10, multiplied by E5 to E10, close the bracket, and then to make it an array formula, so to do all of the calculations in one go, I would press Control Shift Enter, and it gives me the answer of 810, which is this total here. So I've kind of missed out all of the steps. I haven't had to work out this. I've just got straight away the total. And what you'll notice is with an array formula up above, you can see that it's an array because it has these curly braces around the outside. Okay. So that's the concept of an array formula. And it's important to sort of at least understand that a little bit because we're going to use it to use this trend function for forecasting. Now, the trend function itself isn't particularly complicated or confusing, but we're going to do it up here in the formula bar. We're going to type in equals trend, open bracket. Now, this should start to look fairly familiar to you, known y's, known x's. So we want our known y's again, just here, comma. Known x's are these ones just here, comma. Now it's asking for the new x's. So this is what we haven't filled out yet. So it's going to be 13 to 17 or C17 to C21, comma. Now we have to add a true or a false argument on the end. And in this particular scenario, we're going to select true because true means it's going to calculate as an intercept. And if you remember in that first example, the intercept is what we need in order to work out that forecast linear model. So we're going to add true on the end just here. Close the bracket. Now we're going to make this an array formula. It's going to do all of those calculations in one go. So we press Control, Shift, Enter in order for that to work. And again, you'll see that now the trend has those curly braces at the top. It's given me 107. I can copy this down and it gives me my results. Okay, so you can see that each time we're doing this, these results are pretty much the same. So I've shown you a few different methods there of how you can forecast using different functions in Excel. Hopefully everybody is still with me. Let's move across to probably what is the simplest way of forecasting in Excel, and that is one-click forecasting. Anything that says one click, I like, but I will say it is a bit of a lie because it's not essentially one click. There is a couple of clicks, but I think the main point they're trying to make here is that it is super easy to forecast using this particular feature. Now, again, this one-click forecasting is better known as forecast sheets, and you'll find this option on the data ribbon over in the forecast group, this forecast sheet button just here. And what this essentially does is it just creates a new little worksheet and it predicts your data trends and it gives you a lovely little graph as well, or a lovely little chart which you can modify and format however you like. And it's really just a really nice quick way of creating a forecast without having to type formulas and all of that kind of stuff. So let's take a look at our data. Again, this is fairly simple data. This is time-based data. And what I mean by that is that we have our dates and then we have some sales figures. And my dates here are evenly spaced. So I'm taking a reading on the 1st of every single month. And then I have my sales figures over here, which aren't necessarily evenly spaced. like these dates are. But it is quite important to make sure that your dates are evenly spaced to make your forecast more accurate. Now, again, what I can see here is that the sales for this company are increasing as we go through the different months. Now, another thing that you need to note here is that you can have gaps in your data. So maybe you have a data set which isn't completely full. So you might have some missing sales figures for a couple of months. That's absolutely fine. In fact, you can have up to 30% of data points missing, and Excel will still be able to give you a reasonably accurate forecast. Okay, so if you have the odd figure missing, it's not too much of a problem. Now, what we're going to do here is we're going to forecast up until the end of August. So essentially, my last forecast date is going to be the 1st of September 2019. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all of my data here, like so, including the headings. I'm going to go up to the data ribbon and I'm going to click on Forecast Sheet. And you can see here, it pops up with this really nice little line chart. And it's worth noting that you can toggle between line charts and a column chart if you prefer. And what you'll see here is that your dates or your actual dates are shown in blue, and then your forecast is shown in orange. Now it's showing me up until the end of up until the 1st of November. And that's because underneath it says forecast end, and then it's got the date down here. So I can go in and change that because I only want to forecast up until the 1st of September. Okay, so you can change that forecast end. So now I can see what my forecast is going to be for the next 3 months. And what you also see just above here, and it's very faint, hopefully you can pick that up on your screen, is we have these what we call confidence bounds. They almost look like little error bars. They're a little bit easier to see if we switch to the line chart. So you can see here in blue, we have the sales figures that we know. We then have our forecast sales, which runs through the middle here, and then we have a lower confidence bound and an upper confidence bound. So this is kind of giving us a range, okay? Now, if we expand this little options area at the bottom, we have a few more options that we can essentially customize. So what I can do here is I can set my forecast start date as well. And you'll see that mine is starting where my last data point ends. So forecast start is June, sorry, I get so confused when the dates are the other way around, is the June the 1st. That's what I meant. Forecast start date is June the 1st. We then have our confidence interval. So as I said, you have a lower confidence bound and an upper confidence bound. And this confidence interval is the range surrounding each predicted value. So I have this set to 95%. So what Excel is telling me is that 95% of my sales figures are going to fall within this range. Okay. Now I could choose to turn those confidence bounds off simply by unclicking that. If I just want to see a straight forecast, I can do that. And I could also modify the confidence interval. So if I want to go up in confidence, so if I start to go up towards 100%, you'll see that that confidence bounds upper and lower get further apart. Whereas if I was to put the confidence down, they're going to get closer together. Now the default here is 95%, and I'm pretty happy with 95% of my sales figures. I have a confidence level they're going to fall within that range. We then have an option down here for seasonality, and mine is set to detect automatically. So seasonality is a number, so let's say a number of points of the seasonal pattern. And for the most part, it's automatically detected. So for an example, in a sales cycle or a yearly sales cycle, each point would represent a month. So the seasonality would essentially be 12. You might have a different seasonal pattern in your data. So maybe you have sales data where you have a sharp spike towards Christmas. Maybe you sell Christmas trees, I don't know, and you have, fairly poor sales for most of the year. But then as it gets towards Christmas, your sales start to increase. So maybe you want to set it to 4 for the 4 seasons of the year. It depends what your data looks like. Now, I'm happy with mine to detect automatically because I just have months of the year and sales data. I can also choose to include forecast statistics. Now, I would say that if you're really into your forecasting and you require a lot of statistical information, you could check this box and it's going to give you a lot of high-level forecasting information. I would say for the average person who just wants to kind of predict sales or predict stock prices, you're probably not going to need to include those statistics, but the option is there if you want to. We then have our timeline range. This is just our data range, our value range, which is just the ones I've got selected here, the date and the sales. When it comes to fill missing points, so again, we spoke about this earlier. I said to you, you can have missing data points up to 30%. And I like to have mine set to, and I can never say this word, interpolation. I don't know if that's right. Interpolate those values. And what that basically means is that if I did have missing data, Excel is going to look at the values either side of that month and work out its best guess for that missing data. The other option I have in here is I could choose to fill those missing data points with zeros. I prefer it to try and guess based on the previous months and the future months. And then finally at the bottom here, we have aggregate duplicates. So you might use this if you have multiple readings on the same date. So an example of that might be a meteorologist who forecasts the weather. They might be taking a reading of rainfall on the same day, but from different sources. So what you can do is you can, if you have multiple values for the same date, you can essentially average those values, or you can choose to find the max, the min, the sum, so on and so forth. So lots of different options that you have in there. Now I'm going to keep all of these on the defaults. I'm happy with my confidence level being at 95. My forecast end date is set correctly, and I'm going to say create. And you can see here exactly what it does. It creates me a brand new worksheet, which I can then rename, and it gives me my forecast. So helpfully, I now have all of my figures in a table. I have my historical data, and then I have my forecasted data. I can see forecasted sales, but I can also see the lower confidence bound and the upper confidence bound as well. And I also get that nice little line chart over at the side, which shows those details as well. Now, of course, with these charts, you can treat these as you would any other chart. So if you don't like this particular design, you have your chart design. You can change the colors. You can change the chart style. You can even change the chart type that you're using. Okay, so you can come in here and you can change the chart type to something else entirely. So that is quite a nice way of just with one click being able to forecast your data. Now, something else you might want to put onto this chart might be something like a trend line. So I'm quickly going to add one. I'm going to click the little plus. And when it comes to adding chart elements, I could go through and add a chart title, all that kind of stuff, but I'm just going to add a trend line. And it's going to ask me what data series do I want to add my trend line for. So I'm going to add the trend line for sales. I'm going to click on OK. And you can see there it's very close to my actual sales. But something that I wanted to point out to you here, because I think this is quite an interesting point, is I'm going to try and click on this trend line. I'm going to right click and I'm going to say Format Trend Line. Now what I'm going to do is you can see here I have my trend line options, and currently I have a linear trend line going on in my line chart. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to scroll down, and right at the bottom I have this option here that says display R squared value on chart. Now I'm just going to turn that on for 1 second, and it gives me this little equation over here. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, why on earth is that useful? Well, I will tell you. When you're doing a trend line, the idea, or the one that's going to be most suitable or closest to your data, will have an R² value closer to 1. So currently I have a linear trend line selected, and you can see the R² value is 0.98. So that is pretty close to 1. What I could do is select exponential trend line, and I can see that that's still pretty close, but it's not as good as linear. Okay, I can then go through each of these trend lines. I can see that that one is further away, probably won't use that. This one here, again, I can't say this, polynomial. Somebody can help me out with that pronunciation, but I can see that this one is the closest to 1. So that is going to be the most accurate trend line for my data. So sometimes I like to turn on that little R² when I'm trying to work out what kind of trend line I want to use, which one is closest to my data set. And then I can delete that out afterwards. So that is pretty much everything I wanted to show you when it comes to forecasting. Hopefully we've covered a lot of the basics there. As I said, we could go into this a lot more. There are all those different kinds of forecast functions that you might want to utilize. But if you're simply somebody who wants to be able to predict sales or predict stocks, things like that, you're going to find something like Forecast Sheet really useful. Or even if you just want to use the FORECAST.LINEAR function, hopefully I've shown you how simple those arguments are. You just input your known values and it will do a forecast for you. So let me just very briefly introduce myself, because I know that not everybody is a regular to our webinar. So my name is Deborah Ashby and I'm a Microsoft IT trainer. So I specialize in the design, delivery and facilitation of all things Microsoft, both in the classroom and online. And if you can't already tell by the accent, I am based in an extremely warm London, England. We're having some freakishly high temperatures today, which makes not being able to go outside all that more annoying. But nevertheless, we are here. We have a webinar to amuse ourselves with for the next hour. So the topic today, what if analysis? Let's take a look at our agenda. So if you've never heard of or never even used WhatIf Analysis tools before, I'll just briefly explain what they are to you and why they might be useful. But I will say, with these tools, the easiest way of understanding how they work and what they are is just really to see a demo. So we're going to try and get into that as quickly as possible. I'm going to start out with the PMT function. Now, that isn't a what-if analysis tool. It is a function that's available in Excel. But the PMT function does work really well with what-if analysis. So we're going to throw that in at the start. You get to learn an additional function if you don't know how to use that, as well as what-if analysis. So that can't be bad. 2 for 1. We're then going to go through 3 examples of using the Goal Seek tool. I'm then going to show you how you can work with Scenario Manager. And then we're going to delve into the wonderful world of data tables, 1 variable data tables and also 2 variable data tables. And then we're going to finish out the session by taking a look at how we can use the Solver add-in. And I will say that this is an add-in. So when we get to that section, I'm going to show you how you can install that into your Excel. For a lot of you, you might not automatically see Solver within your Excel. It's not something that you have to download from a website. It is available. It's just a little setting that you need to turn on within Excel. So I'm going to show you how you do that when we get to that part. So let's just start out very briefly with that first question. What is what if analysis? Right, so we're talking about what if analysis. So what if analysis is basically the process of changing the values in cells to see how those changes will affect the outcome of formulas on the worksheet. Now, as I said, I can sit here and explain it to you, but it's really not going to make much sense until you start seeing some examples. Now, before we get into that, I just want to show you where your what-if analysis tools are located. Now, you'll find them on the data ribbon in Excel. And if you look over in the forecast group, you should have an option there for what-if analysis. And you can see there I have 3 of my tools: Scenario Manager, Goal Seek, and Data Table. Now there is a 4th, as I mentioned, that is the solver. And I have that over here in my Analyze group. I have my solver sitting up there. Now, as I said, unless you've installed the add-in, you're not going to be able to see that. So when we get to solver, I'll show you how you can very quickly install that add-in. All right, let's start out by taking a look at Goal Seek. Now, in order to demonstrate this, I want to start out by just completing this little table here using the function called PMT. Now, if you've never used PMT before, this is a financial function. So if we jump to our formulas ribbon, you will find it located under our financial group just here. If I scroll down, there it is just there. And basically what it does is it calculates the payment for a loan based on constant payments and a constant interest rate. So what we're going to do first is I'm just going to complete this PMT calculation, and then I'm going to show you how it works with Goal Seek. So let's take a look at our data in this first little table at the top. Now we're going to imagine the scenario that I want to buy a new car, and I need to borrow $24,000 from the bank in order to do that. And the bank are going to lend it to me at an interest rate per annum of 3.5%. And I'm borrowing that money over a term of 60 months. So what I basically want to work out here using that PMT function is how much my payment is going to be each month with these criteria. So we're going to use the PMT function. So I'm going to type in equals. I'm going to type in PMT and open my bracket. Now you can see underneath I have my arguments. So the first argument this function requires is rate. So looking at my table above, you can see here is my rate, cell B3. Now one thing you have to be aware of here, if you're working out a monthly payment, it means that all of your input has to be monthly. So this rate is per annum, so per year. So what I need to do is do divided by 12 to get that rate per month, comma. It's then asking me NPER. So this basically means the number of payments. So that would be the term. Now that's split down into months, 60 months, which is essentially 5 years. So I'm good to just enter in B4 as my second argument, comma. Finally, I have PV. Now that stands for present value. So what is the loan amount essentially? So it's cell B5. Now you'll notice that there are 2 other arguments there, FV for future value and also type, but those arguments are in squared brackets. Now if you ever see arguments in squared brackets, it means that those are optional. Now in this particular scenario, I don't need those. I'm good with what I have here. So I'm going to close my bracket, hit enter, and it tells me that I'm going to be making a monthly payment of $436.60. Now, the thing you'll notice here is that it's showing in red. It's showing as a negative value. So the formatting I have for negative values is that they show up in red and they're in brackets. Now, the reason why it shows as a negative is because it sort of thinks that this is the money that's coming out of your account. It's negative to you, essentially. You're going to be paying this amount of money. Now, if in this spreadsheet I didn't particularly want this to show as a negative, I could go back into my formula, and then just before B5, so just before this loan amount, if I type in a minus and press enter, it's going to turn that into a positive value. All right, so that is the PMT function. We're going to be using it a couple more times in other examples. Hopefully that makes sense. So now let's move on to how we can use Goal Seek in order to make a change to this formula. So looking at this, I'm saying to myself, okay, so my payment is going to be $436.60 every single month, but I've actually budgeted for $500 a month. That's how much I can spend. So I'm going to use Goal Seek to tell me how much more I could borrow if I was paying $500. Okay, so I'm going to jump up to the data ribbon. I'm going to go across to WhatIf Analysis, and I'm going to select the Goal Seek option. And this is a very simple little utility. The first thing it asks you is to set the cell. So I want to set this cell to 500 because that's how much I can afford. And what do I want to change? Well, I want to borrow more money. So I want to see how much I can borrow if I can pay $500 a month. So I'm just going to select the loan amount cell and click on OK. And you can see there very quickly, it's telling me if I pay $500 a month, I can borrow $27,485. Okay. Now, similarly, I could do that on a different cell. So let me just cancel that so it goes back to how it was. If I go back to WhatIf Analysis and back down to Goal Seek, again, I'm going to say set this cell to 500. But this time I want to see, let's see how many months I can pay that over if I'm paying $500 a month. So I'm going to select this cell instead and click on OK. So if I'm paying $500 a month and I'm still borrowing just $24,000, it's only going to take me 52 months to pay that back. Okay, so that is kind of how Goal Seek works. Let's use it in a different example. Let's scroll down. Now here I have something slightly different. So we have some test scores here. So let's just pretend these are test scores for a student. And you can see all these different scores for these different subjects. Now the student has to get an average score of 80 in order to pass all of their classes with a grade A. Now they haven't yet sat their English literature test, but as the student, I want to know what the grade is that I need to get in order to pass with an average of 80 across all subjects. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to say equals, I'm just going to work out the average. So average, open bracket. I'm going to highlight all of these cells, including that blank cell. I'm going to close my bracket and hit enter. Now, in order for Goal Seek to work here, you need to put just any old number in here. So I'm going to say 100. And then I'm going to use Goal Seek to work this out. I'm going to go up to WhatIf Analysis. I'm going to go down to Goal Seek. And this time I'm going to say, set this cell to value 80 by changing this cell. Okay, so this cell has to have a value in it in order for Goal Seek to work, which is why you kind of need to enter something in there if the cell is blank. So if I click on OK, I can see here that to get an average of 80 across all of my classes, I only need to get a score of 64 in my English literature exam. All right, Goal Seek in two different examples. Let's take a look at one more example of Goal Seek. Now here what we have is just a table, and these are employee names. We've got the department that they reside in, their employment status, so whether they're full-time, contract, so on and so forth, their hire date, the number of years they've worked there, their salary, their job rating, and then their new salary. So currently, everybody's got a 2.7% increase. So all of these salaries have been increased, and that's what gives us that new salary number, the increase of 2.7%. Now, if I jump down by doing Control down arrow to the bottom of this list, you can see here that the total for all of those salaries is $2,418,042. Now, I've been told that I have a budget for all staff salaries of $2.5 million. So I'm currently just under budget. So what I want to do is I want to increase all of these salaries so that I hit my 2,500. So I can use Goal Seek to do this as well. So again, if we go down to this cell just here, I'm going to jump up to WhatIf Analysis and I'm going to go to Goal Seek. And I'm going to say set cell H52 to value, and I can never remember how many zeros I need. Let's scroll up. And there we go. So I'm going to set it to 2500000. I always get that wrong, so I like to make sure what I'm doing is correct. So I want to set that cell to 2.5 million by changing this increase cell here, because this is going to feed through to these formulas. And when I click on OK, there we go. It's increased those salaries. I can see the salary increase is now 6.2%. And if I scroll down, it's now exactly 2.5 million. All right, so GoalSeek really helps you just kind of put what it is you're looking for, and then it will adjust some of the other calculations to show you how you can essentially get to that point. All right, so a really useful little tool. So that is our 3 examples of utilizing GoalSeek. Let's move on to our second WhatIf analysis tool, which is the Scenario Manager. So we're going to jump across to our next spreadsheet. Now again, this is a fairly simple example of how you can utilize scenarios, and you can come up with all different weird and wonderful ways to use this. But I think this is probably one of the simplest ways of explaining it to you. Now, scenarios help us show what our values look like under different conditions or in essentially different scenarios. So it kind of helps you visualize what your numbers are going to look like if a certain scenario occurs. So let's set the scene here so you understand what we're trying to do. Now, here I have just a basic monthly budget. So I've got at the top here my monthly income. I then have all of my monthly expenses, so things like rent, travel, the utilities, all of those kinds of things. I then have my total expenses, which is essentially a calculation. You can see there in the formula bar, I'm just summing B3 to B9. And then I have the amount left. And again, that's just a very simple calculation of B1, so my monthly income, minus my expenses. And that tells me how much money I'm going to have left over at the end of every month. Now, to make this a little bit clearer to see, and if any of you attended the last webinar that I did, I speak a lot about cell styles. So the way that I've colored these, I've just done this using cell styles. Now, if you've never used them before, you'll find them on the home ribbon underneath cell styles here. And I've basically colored these as input cells. So this is where we're going to input our numbers. And then these cells here that contain formulas, I've just made calculation cells. Now, this is purely formatting, and it just really helps your spreadsheet be a little bit more readable if you kind of separate out what cells are input cells, what cells are calculations, so on and so forth. Now, what we're going to do here is this is my current budget. Now, what if I want to see what my overall budget is going to look like if I take that promotion that my manager keeps trying to get me to go for? I then might want to see what my monthly budget looks like if I decide to go for that new job that I've been eyeing up. Or I may want to see what my financial situation is going to look like if I decide to go out on my own as a freelancer. So essentially, I've got 4 different scenarios there, and I really want to use Scenario Manager to kind of make it really easy for me to see which one's going to be best for me financially, okay? So we're going to set up a whole bunch of different scenarios and view all of those different situations. So we're going to go back up to our data ribbon. We're going to go across to WhatIf Analysis, and I'm going to select Scenario Manager. And you'll get this sort of pop-up just here. And we now need to add in some of our scenarios. So I'm going to click Add. And the first thing I would always recommend you do is that you create a scenario called Original, which will just have your original scenario or what we're looking at here. So you can always go back to it if things go a little bit wrong. So I'm going to call this Original. And it's asking me, what are the changing cells? So if I was to get a promotion, let's say, what out of this is going to change? Well, my monthly income might change. Maybe if I get a promotion, I'm going to be earning more money. So this cell might change. But if I'm earning more money, then maybe I'm going out on the town a little bit more. So this figure might change. Or maybe I might be shopping more if I've got more spare cash at the end of the month. So this figure might change. So my changing cells are really going to be my monthly income, and it could be any of these, okay? So in this changing cells area, I'm going to select monthly income. I'm then going to hold down my control key, and I'm going to select the rest of these cells. These other cells at the bottom, totals and amount left, these are dependent on these. So these are calculations which will just update depending on what's going on up here. Okay, so these are the only cells that are going to be changing. And I'm going to click on OK. So now it's telling me enter values for each of these changing cells. Now, one thing that's not very helpful here is that you can see 3,000, that is my monthly income, 1,200, that's my rent. But in this scenario manager, it's just showing me the cell reference. So it's not particularly meaningful. It's quite hard for me to say straight away what this 150 is because it just says cell B4. It doesn't mean a great deal. I prefer it if I have next to each of these cells the actual thing that they refer to. So I want the top one to say monthly income, the next one to say rent, the next one to say travel, so on and so forth. So before I do this, I'm actually going to name these ranges so that this is more meaningful. Okay, so I'm going to cancel out of here. We're going to come back to that in a moment. And let me close that down. Now, a quick way of naming these, and essentially what I want to do is I want to name cell B1 monthly income. I want this cell to be called rent. I want this cell to be called travel. And we can do this by naming ranges, and we can do it very quickly. All I need to do is highlight, and I'm going to hold down my control key to do the rest of these, like so. So I'm essentially highlighting what I want them labeled and the value. I'm going to go up to formulas, and in this define names group, I'm going to say create from selection. So it says it's going to create names from values, and it's already selected for me left column. So essentially it's saying, do you want me to name these cells based on what's in that left column? Which is correct. So I'm going to say, okay. So now all of these cells are named with these labels. And I can double check that by clicking on my name box just above, which is where all of your named ranges are held. And you can see that I now have those ranges set up in there. So now when we go back into our scenario manager through WhatIf Analysis, and I say add, and we're going to do original. By changing cells, let's delete that out. B1, going to hold down control, select those changing cells and click on OK. And now these are named. It's a lot easier for me to see what they are. Okay, so that's a little tip in there. Name those cells. Now, this is the original scenario. I don't want anything to change here, so I'm going to say OK. So that's my first scenario set up. I'm going to add another one. Now, this scenario is going to be for if I take that promotion that Adam is so generously offering me. And my changing cells are going to stay the same. So it's going to be the same cells. I'm going to click on OK. But now I can change these values. So if I get a promotion, maybe that means I'm going to be earning more. So I'm going to change that to 3,500. Now, if I'm earning more, a lot of these are going to stay the same. So my rent's going to be the same, travel, because I'm not changing jobs, I'm just getting a promotion. But I might decide that I'm going to do a little bit more shopping than I normally do because I've got more disposable money. Maybe I'm going to go out a little bit more as well. So I'm going to change that to 400. I'm going to click on OK. So I have two different scenarios now. Let's add another one. And this one is going to be called new job. Changing cells are still the same. I'm going to click on OK. Now, if I take that new job is quite a bit more money. So that's going to be 4,000 a month I'm going to have coming in. The problem here is that that new job is a little bit further away. So I'm going to have to spend more on travel. So I'm going to be spending, let's say, 300 a month on travel. And I do have a little bit more money, so I'm going to, let's say, 275, just to account for my additional travel. And I'm going to keep going out at 350 and click on OK. Let's add one more scenario. Let's click Add. And this time, what if I decide just to go out on my own as a freelancer? Well, I'm going to have to be a little bit careful while my business gets started. So my monthly income is going to be a little bit lower. It's going to be 2,500. My travel, well, I'm now working from home. I'm a freelancer. I don't have to travel anywhere, just to my lounge from my bedroom. That's going to be 0. My utilities, well, I'm actually going to put a lot of my utilities on my expenses. So let's put that down a bit to 200. And shopping, I'm going to try and be a bit more conservative when it comes to shopping, just while my business is getting going. So I'm going to say 150 there for shopping. Okay, and click on OK. So very quickly, I've set up 4 different scenarios, which is going to enable me to see really easily what these different scenarios or what my financial situation is going to look like depending on each of these scenarios. Now, one way I can look at this is I can switch between them. So if I want to look at the details for the promotion, I can select it, and at the bottom I have a show button, and you'll see as soon as I click it, these numbers are going to change. So let's say show. All right, so I can now see that if I take that promotion, the amount of money I have left at the end of the month is $980, which is a lot better than what I'm doing now. What about if I take that new job? How much money am I going to have left? Let's see. Ooh, a lot better off. That's looking good to me so far. But what about freelancing? Let's see. Ooh, that's really not very good. So I can see there that for financial reasons, taking the new job is probably going to be my best option. Now that's all well and good, and I'm going to set this back to the original. But I don't want to have to keep switching between those different scenarios to see them. What would be really useful would be to have some kind of table which does a direct comparison between all of the scenarios that I have set up. And we can do that by clicking on this summary button at the bottom. And I'm going to select to do a scenario summary. It's also worth noting you could do a pivot table report from this as well if you wanted to. But for now, we're going to do a scenario summary. I'm going to click on OK. And you can see it puts them side by side. So it's showing me my current values, the original, the promotion, new job, and freelance. And I can see all my totals at the bottom there. Now, one thing you might also notice here is something that we didn't do. Can you see here, result cells? It's showing me the cell reference. It's not saying amount left. Now, if I wanted that to say amount left, what I would need to do would be to go back and name this range. Like we did with the rest of these, we'd want to name that the same way that we did these. Okay, and then you'll have the word amount left at the bottom there as opposed to the cell reference. Okay. So that is kind of how scenario summary works. As I said, a really basic example, but you can do this on financial figures, lots of different scenarios that you can set up. So hopefully you can kind of see how that might be useful in certain situations that you work on. Wonderful. Now I'm going to just delete that like so. All right, so that is Scenario Manager. Now, the next one that we have to look at in here is data tables. Now, when it comes to data tables, there are 2 different kinds of data tables you can create. You can create what we call a 1 variable data table or a 2 variable data table. And these are sometimes better than creating scenarios because you can create a data table to quickly try out different values for formulas. So again, this is one that's a lot easier to understand if you see it in action. Now, as you can see here, we are going to do our good old favorite PMT. As I said, it does work very well with WhatIf Analysis tools. We're going to do another PMT calculation up here. Now, I'm going to do this a slightly different way. Instead of just typing it into the cell, I'm going to jump into my functions dialog box just by clicking on this FX to insert a function. I'm going to do a quick search up here for PMT and click on Go. I'm going to double click to select it. Now, I will say that if you're not all that familiar with working with formulas and functions, I know a lot of people who find using this dialog box a lot easier when it comes to constructing their formulas as opposed to just typing them into the cell. So I thought I'd throw it in this way as well, just so you can see how that works if you're not too familiar. Now, we have our same arguments just here. So our rate this time is our interest rate just here. So that is yearly. So we need to divide it by 12 because we're working out a monthly payment. And number of payments here is 30 months. So I'm going to select this cell just there. And then our present value is our loan amount. And remember, if we want this to come out as a positive number, we need to put a minus figure in front of that loan amount and click on OK. So that's telling me that for these conditions, my monthly payment is going to be $342.01. So let's take a look at this in a data table. So basically what I want to do here is I want to see what my monthly payment's going to be for multiple different interest rates. So I'm going to list out some interest rates here starting at 1% all the way through to roughly 3%. And I want to see what my monthly payment's going to be if against all of those different interest rates. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to type in interest rate at the top here. I'm going to start out at 1, so let's do 1.00%. So, and then we're going to go up in small incremental. So now once you've typed in 2 of them, if I highlight both, Excel will recognize the pattern. So I can use my little autofill handle. I can drag it down. You can see as I'm dragging down, it's going down in those incrementals of 0.25. So I can drag all the way down for however many I need. Now what I need to do, and this may seem a little bit strange first of all, so bear with me. I need to have my current monthly payment in this cell just here. And the reason why you put it there is because when you do a data table, you need to be able to highlight essentially your interest rate. You need to be able to highlight it like that in a square. So you need to have what it's going to use as its input within that data table. So I'm going to link to my monthly payment equals and select the cell, press enter. And that's just doing a straight link from this table up here. So now what I can do is I can highlight everything, go up to WhatIf Analysis, down to Data Table, and we get this little option just here. Now, as I said, this is a one variable data table because we're just using one variable, which is this here, the interest rate. And this interest rate is running down in the column. So the only one I need to fill out here is the column input cell. So it's saying, okay, what is the input cell? Well, the input cell is the interest rate. So in here, I need to select the interest rate from the table above and click on OK. And now it gives me everything I need. Now I need to do a little bit of formatting here. I'm going to highlight these. I'm going to go to the home ribbon and I'm going to add the currency symbol like so. Okay, so now I can see that if the interest rate is 1.75%, I'm going to be paying $340.92 every single month. All right, and I can just do a quick visual check to make sure that this is correct, because up here I can see that with an interest rate at 2%, if we go down to here, it should be 342.01, which it is in this data table. Okay. Now, another little trick here, if you've got this link cell at the top here, it doesn't look particularly great. If you want to hide that little link cell at the top, there is a quick shortcut way that you can do this. Now, there's a shortcut key, which I hope is going to work when I'm on a call, because sometimes my function keys don't work. I'm going to try it. Control F1. No, that doesn't seem to work. Just bear with me. No, it doesn't seem to like that very much at all. So I'm going to have to do it the manual way. If we right click and go down to Format Cells, what you can do is jump across to Custom. And in this type area, I'm going to type in 3 semicolons. 1, 2, 3. Click on OK. And that will hide that link cell from your data table. So it just makes it look a little bit neater. It's still there, so when you click on it, if you look up in the formula bar, you can see it says equals B6. You're just not seeing it in your data table. What I might do then is just apply some basic formatting. So I'm going to select my data table. I'm just going to give it some borders. I might want to center everything. And another thing that's quite nice to do is I might want to add something like conditional formatting in here as well. So I'm going to highlight these numbers. I'm going to jump up to conditional formatting and I'm just going to add some color scales. And again, you don't have to do this, but it's just quite a nice way of representing the numbers in your data table. So in this selection that we've made, the highest number is in red and the lowest number is in blue. All right, so it just makes your data look a little bit more interesting. So that is how you would use a one input data table. Let's jump across to our next example, which is using two inputs. So in the previous example, we just had one input running down in the column, but now we have two inputs that we need to use in this data table. Now again, I have a little PMT calculation that I'm going to do up here. So I'm going to use my functions dialog box again. I'm going to double click to select PMT. I'm going to do the same thing. So my rate here, yearly, divide by 12 to make it monthly. Now my number of payments, so this is the term. Now this is slightly different in this example. So here the term is years, 30 years. Now I'm working out monthly. So for this one, I need to do B4 multiplied by 12. And then my present value is the loan amount. And again, I need to put a minus sign on the front if I want to make that positive. And click on OK. So my monthly payment, and this might be on something like a house, that's what this kind of setup looks like. My monthly payment is going to be 1,264. I have the wrong currency formatted there, so let's just change that. There we go. So now I'm going to do exactly the same thing, but we're doing two inputs this time. So again, we need to link to our input. So that is equals B5. Enter. Now I can highlight the entire table, go up to the data ribbon and across to WhatIf Analysis, and I'm going to say data table. Now because we have two inputs this time, I need to fill in both the row input cell and the column input cell. So our row input cell is this running across the row. So this is going to be the interest rate. So I need to select that from our table at the top. And then our column input, this is the loan amount in this case. So I select that from my input table. Click on OK. And there we go. And again, you're probably going to want to do some tidying up here. I'm going to add some symbols like so. And again, you could do some really cool conditional formatting if you wanted to. Once again, you could go in and hide this. So just to recap how you hide the input cell, if we right click, go down to Format Cells. I'm going to click on Custom Formatting, and I'm going to do 3 semicolons, like so. Okay, so that is a 1 variable data table and a 2 variable data table. Quite a lot to take in and get your head around. Again, these come with practice. Just have a little practice, play around with them. Now, the final thing I want to show you, and this is really the final WhatIf analysis tool. There's only really 4 of them. 3 of them we've already seen, but the final one is Solver. Now, if you look on my data ribbon, you'll see that I have my Solver tool in this Analyze group at the end. Now, as I mentioned, if you're looking at your Excel right now and you're looking on your data ribbon and thinking to yourself, I can't see Solver anywhere, don't worry, it's not installed by default. It is an add-in that you need to turn on if you're going to use it. So let's deal with that first of all. If you need to turn this on, if you jump to File, go all the way down to Options, and you'll find all of your add-ins under this Add-ins section. And you can see here at the top, I have my Solver add-in installed. So what you'll find is that you will see Solver add-in listed somewhere in here. And all you do is select it and you can install it that way. It's a very simple process. Once you've done that, you will then see it appear on your data ribbon. Now, what Solver is it's kind of like a more advanced version of Goal Seek. So if we just go back to Goal Seek for 1 second, when we were doing these examples here, when we were utilizing Goal Seek, and I'm just going to bring that up just here, we were basically setting this cell to 500 and saying change one of these other cells. Now, the limitations with Goal Seek is that you can only change one cell. So I could either change the amount that I'm borrowing, or I could change the term, the number of months I'm borrowing over, but I couldn't change both of them. Okay, that is where Solver comes in, because it allows you to essentially change multiple cells, and you can also do things like add in constraints as well. So let me show you how it works. Let's jump back to Solver. Now, I will say a lot of people tend to shy away from Solver because they think it's incredibly complicated, and it really isn't once you start using it. So I'm going to try and explain this in the easiest way possible. Now, I have a very basic scenario up here. This is some concert ticket sales. So I can see at the top here, it says tickets sold, 2,500, price per ticket, $30, revenue, 75,000. So this is for a concert. If I sell these at this price, that is how much revenue I'm going to make. And you can see they're up in the formula bar. It says B3 multiplied by B4. Okay, so I'm multiplying these two together to get my amount of revenue. Now, there are some associated costs per each ticket. So that might be things like paying for the artist, lighting, all of those kinds of things. So the fixed costs per ticket are $10. So the total costs, B3, so it's the total number of tickets times the cost per ticket, and that gives me 25,000. So my profit is essentially my revenue minus my costs, which gives me a total of 50,000. So what we're going to do is we're going to set up a scenario. We're going to use Solver to help work a few things out for us. So I'm going to click on Solver up here. You can see I was doing this earlier. Let me just minus these out. So what we're going to say here is the first thing we need to do is set our objective. So I might say that I need to make a profit of $60,000. Okay, so my objective is that this cell is going to be set to the value of 60,000. That is what I'm aiming for. Okay, again, you can see, let me just delete that out. There we go. All right, so now I need to say which cells are going to be changing. Now, what I'm going to say here is that I want this to change to 60,000 profit, but my cost per ticket, that's kind of set. I can't really change how many costs I incur per ticket. So I'm not going to change this cell. Now, some things I can change here is I want to see how many tickets I would need to sell in order to make a profit of 60,000. And I also want to see what the cost of those tickets are going to be in order for me to make a profit of 60,000. So my changing cells are going to be tickets sold. I'm going to hold down Control and select price per ticket. Now let's just solve this to see what it does. So there we go. So you can see now it's changed my profit to 60,000 and it's changed these two cells at the top. So now I can see that in order to make that much profit, I need to sell 2,648 tickets at a price of $33. All right. Now that's all well and good. That might be exactly what I'm looking for. But you can take this a step further when you're using Solver by adding in certain constraints. So it might be that I look at this and I say to myself, well, I've been told by the venue that they just can't sell tickets over $30. So I'm going to make a modification to my Solver and add in that constraint. Now I'm going to cancel out of here so it goes back to how it was. I'm going to click on Solver again. My objective is still the same. I want this cell, B10, to be 60,000. I'm going to change these two cells so I can leave this as it was because it's just picking up the values I had in there from last time. But I'm going to add in a constraint. And you can see underneath, this is where you can add in different constraints. So I'm going to say add. Now my constraint here is that the price per ticket, so this cell here, has to be less than or equal to 30. It can't be greater than $30. I'm going to say OK. And if I wanted to, I could go through and I can add in more and more constraints. And that might be something that you want to do depending on the problem that it is that you're trying to solve. But I just kind of really wanted to introduce Solver to you at this stage. So we're not going to go too complex in the time that we have. But we have our constraint in there. I'm going to say solve. And there we go. So now I can see my profit is 60,000. My cost hasn't changed, which is good because that's fixed. My price per ticket is $30, but I now need to sell 3,000 tickets. Okay, so it's worked out all of those little problems for me, including those constraints. And I'm going to say okay to that. Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar on macros and basic VBA in Excel. I hope everyone is doing good as always from wherever in the world you're joining us from today. Now, I know that we normally get quite a lot of regulars on this call, but if we do have any new people who have never come across me before, then my name is Deborah Ashby and I'm a Microsoft IT trainer. And I basically specialize in the design, delivery and facilitation of Microsoft training, both online and in the classroom. And I'm quite excited today because we are covering a topic that we haven't done it for a really long time. I can't even remember the last time we did a webinar on VBA or macros or anything along those lines. So this is going to be quite nice. But I would say that these two topics are possibly a bit more on the advanced end of Excel. Although saying that, we are going to stick with some of the more basic topics in this webinar. And as always, we're going to start from the beginning and work our way up. So even if you have no experience with macros or VBA, you should still be able to follow along with what I'm doing. It's not going to get extremely complicated. So let's jump in and take a quick look at today's agenda. This is what we're going to cover. So we're going to start out just by discussing exactly what macros are, just so that everybody has a clear understanding. I'm then going to show you quite a few examples of macros in action. So I've set up about 7 or so already in a worksheet, and I'm just going to run them and show you how they work. I'm then going to talk to you a little bit about VBA. And again, if you've never used VBA, don't worry at all. Everything's going to be explained as we go through. We're then going to go into how we can record, save, and run a macro. And I'm going to show you how you can record a macro with relative referencing. Once we've done that, we're then going to move on to taking a look at a slightly more complex macro where we're kind of joining together lots of different procedures into one. I'm going to show you the VBA editor window. So as you get more confident in your VBA skills, you can dive into there and start making changes to your code to get your macros to behave in different ways. I'm going to show you how Excel builds your VBA code when you're creating a macro. And I'm going to show you how you can make minor edits to your VBA code. Nothing too scary or too extraordinary, but just little things just to help you understand exactly what it is that you're looking at. And then finally, I'm just going to show you a couple of cool things you can do to make your worksheets a bit more interactive using macros by assigning them to things like buttons, form controls, icons, and pictures. So that's what we're going to go through in this session. So let's come out of here. We don't need that thank you slide just yet. And I'm going to dive across to the first Excel spreadsheet that we're going to be using. So let's start out with that all-important question, what exactly is a macro? Well, a macro is really just a fancy term that really just describes the process of automating tasks. So for example, maybe every week you find yourself putting together a report in Excel, and maybe that report shows weekly sales figures. And each week you open up a brand new Excel spreadsheet, you type in the report title, maybe you then apply some formatting to that title, you then input your sales figures, maybe you create a chart or apply some conditional formatting. All of these are different steps that you have to take in order to get to your end result. Now, what a macro will allow you to do is basically save a lot of time, depending on how long the task is, by automating all of those steps. So instead of having to run through that process each time you create this report, you can click one button and it's going to do everything for you essentially. So it automates time-consuming tasks. That's the best way to look at it. So what I'm going to show you first of all are just a few examples of macros in action. So I've got quite a few tabs at the bottom here, and on this first worksheet, this is the delete blank rows worksheet. I just have some data, it has some blank rows in it, and I've created a macro that's going to automate the task of removing those blank rows. Now, my macros are stored on the Developer tab. Now, I'm going to go through this in a bit more detail so you know exactly what you're looking at. They're in the Macros button, and these are all the macros that I have stored in this particular worksheet. And I've already created these ahead of time. So what I'm going to do here is choose the Delete Blank Rows macro. I'm going to click Run, and you'll see that like magic, it runs and it gets rid of all of those blank rows from this data. If I go across to the next worksheet, I now want to run a macro that's going to apply accounting formatting to whichever cells I've selected. So if I select these columns just here, which contain values, I can then jump back into my macros. I'm going to use my accounting format macro, which is the one at the top, click Run, and it's going to apply that accounting formatting. What about on the next worksheet? Well, here, what I want to do is I want to format this data as a table. So instead of running through the process of doing that, I can again use a macro that I've already created. I can run it, and it applies that formatting to this data. Moving across, what about this one? Well, here I have some basic, again, maybe some sales figures for Q1 to Q4 across the different months of the year, and then I have some total values at the end. And if you take a look in the formula bar, you can see that where I'm clicked, I have formulas sitting behind these cells. Now, maybe I want to get rid of these formulas by doing a paste of the values. So instead of going up to Paste Special and searching for paste values, I've set up a macro that's going to quickly do that for me. So I can select the cells just here, go back to Developer, Macros, and I can choose Paste Values, click Run. And now when I click on the cells in here, if you look at the formula bar, you can see we no longer have a sum calculation there because we just have the values. Let's take a look at another example. Maybe I want to apply some conditional formatting to these cells in here. I'm going to go back to macros. I've set up a little data bars macro, which I can run to apply those very quickly. Another example would be something like removing hyperlinks. So if I just want to make these regular text and not clickable links, I've got another macro that's going to do that for me called remove hyperlink. What about something like creating a new worksheet? Now, this isn't a particularly long process. You can press the Control-N keyboard shortcut, but just to show you that it doesn't necessarily have to be processes working within one worksheet. You can also use it for things like creating new worksheets, opening things, printing, stuff like that. So if I go back to macros, and I think I have a new worksheet one in here. Yes, I do. Click on Run, and you'll see at the bottom of the screen, I now have a new sheet, Sheet 1. Final couple of examples, highlight cells. Again, if I want to maybe apply some conditional formatting to selected cells just here, I've already set it up as a macro with the correct criteria. I'm going to use highlight cells, click Run, and there it goes. And then finally on the end here, we have something that's slightly different. This time I've assigned a macro to a little clickable button. So what I want to happen here is when I click on this button, it's going to run a macro which works out the percentage. So we have revenue and profit, and I want to see what percentage of the revenue the profit is. So if I click on this button, it runs a macro, and there I get my percentage figures. So quite a few different examples there of how macros can be used. And those are very basic examples. I'm really just doing one thing at a time there. Of course, you can make much more complex macros by combining lots of different tasks together, which is what we're going to do in a moment. So what we're going to take a look at first is VBA. So I want to explain VBA a little bit to you first before we start creating macros. So I'm going to keep this worksheet open in the background. Now, if you've never used VBA before, if you've never heard of it before, it basically stands for Visual Basic for Applications. And it's a programming language that you'll find across all of the Microsoft applications. It kind of sits there in the background, and it's used for programming and also running things like applications. So when you create a macro in Excel, what you're essentially doing is you're creating a whole bunch of VBA code. Now, I will say that if you are an Excel user, you could go your entire life not touching VBA at all, and you'd probably be fine. But for people who maybe like to use macros and create their own macros, it is quite important to at least be able to understand what you're looking at so that you're able to make minor or even more complex edits and get your macros doing exactly what you want them to do. Now, before you even start to think about doing anything with macros or VBA, there's one important step that you need to take, and that is you need to make sure that you have your developer ribbon turned on in Excel. So you can see that I'm currently clicked on mine, and this is where you'll find in that code group all of the good stuff related to VBA and macros. Now, the developer tab isn't turned on by default in Excel. So if you can't see it there in your Excel, you're going to need to turn that ribbon on. So all you'll need to do here is go to File and go down to Options. Go to Customize Ribbon, and then on the right-hand side, make sure that you just have a tick in this little developer box just here, and then you should be able to see that ribbon. So once you have that ribbon up, this is where we can go in and pull up the VBA code that's sitting behind whatever Excel spreadsheet we currently have open. So to jump into the VBA code for this particular worksheet, I can click on this first button just here, the Visual Basic button, and there is a keyboard shortcut for that of Alt F11. So let's just click on it and see what we get. Now, the first thing you'll probably notice when this opens is it opens in a brand new window, and this window really does have a very old school look to it. If any of you on this call today are as old as I am and can remember all the way back before we had the nice shiny new ribbons in Microsoft applications, we kind of had a menu system. And this is kind of what you have in this VBA window. We have these menu drop downs running across the top as opposed to ribbons, and we have toolbars instead. Now, what I want to do here is really just start to introduce you to this VBA window, and then we're going to go and start creating some macros and then look at them in this area. Now, I've got a couple of little windows open in this VBA main window, and the first one is the VBA project window. Now, what you can see in here currently is at the top, it's showing me which workbook I have open. So you can see there it says Examples of Macros Copy, which is the workbook that's currently open. Underneath, we then have all of the different worksheets that I have in this workbook, and you can see the name of the worksheet in brackets after the sheet number. And the code for the macros that I've got stored are saved under this little modules folder. So all of your macro code will always be underneath modules. So if I double click on where it says module 1, it's basically going to load up the VBA code for all of the macros I have in this workbook. Now, I don't expect you to understand what we've got going on here, but because I've got about 8 or 9 macros, you can see them all split up here. So this first one, this is the macro for deleting those blank rows. I then have the next macro, which was applying accounting formatting. I then have the next one, which shows the format as table macro, so on and so forth. Okay, so reasonably straightforward to access that macro code. Underneath that, we then have a properties window. Now, currently, the properties window doesn't really have a great deal in here, but in general, this is where I come if I want to give my module a more meaningful name. So when you create new modules, or when they're created for you, when you start creating macros, they'll just be named module 1, module 2, module 3, so on and so forth. So I might want to give this module a name by modifying the name in the properties window down here. So maybe I just want to call this example, something like that, hit enter, and it just makes it a little bit easier for me to identify in this workbook. Now, these different windows, you can turn them off and on depending on which ones you find particularly useful. So if you want to close them down, you can just click the crosses. If you want to open up any other windows, if you go to View, this is kind of where you can see all of the different windows you can have open. And one that I am going to open, because we're going to take a look at this a bit later on, is the immediate window. Keyboard shortcut Control G. And you can see that that's now open, this little blank immediate window underneath my main bulk of code. And we're going to come back to this a bit later on, and I'm going to show you some ways that you can use this immediate window. for the time being, let's close down this VBA window now that we've had a little introduction to it, so it's not going to be as scary when we look at it a bit later on. We're going to close it down and we're going to switch our focus to creating, running and saving macros. So let's close this worksheet down. I'm not going to save it. And I'm going to switch to another worksheet. Let's open this one just here. Okay, so we're going to create our first macro. Now, currently on this page, this worksheet is labeled sales. I don't have anything on here. So what is our task here? Well, our task is going to be to create a weekly overview report by department. So maybe this is a report that you have to produce on a weekly basis and send to each of the heads of the department. Maybe it shows all the different sales teams and the amount of revenue they've generated, and that needs to go out to different heads of department. So maybe we need to put a nice heading onto this report first of all. So instead of doing this every single week, I can create a macro that's going to automate the process of putting a nice report heading at the top. Okay. Now, when it comes to recording a macro, there are a few different places you can go to. So let's take a look at that first of all. The first place you can go to start recording a macro is on the Developer tab. So once you have that turned on, in this code group, you'll see you have a Record Macro button. So that is the first place you can go to. You'll also find the Record Macro button randomly on the View tab in the Macros group at the end. You can see there we also have somewhere we can go to start recording a macro. And the third place we can go to is actually all the way down in the status bar. If you cast your eyes right the way down to the bottom left-hand corner, can you see that little icon down there that I have? If I hover over, it's telling me no macros are currently recording. I can also click here to toggle or stop or start recording a macro. Now again, if you can't see that little icon in your status bar, all you need to do is right-click your mouse on the status bar and make sure you have macro recording ticked in there, and then you'll get that little icon. So you can use any of those methods to start recording your macro. Now, before we start recording, let's just run through the steps I want to take so you can see how I would do this manually. So what I want the macro to do is basically start in cell A1, and I want it to type in weekly overview, whoops, would help if I could spell, overview, sales report by department. What I then want the macro to do is select that first row, go to the Home tab. I want to change the font. I want to change the font size to something a little bit bigger. I want to change the background to a darker blue, and I'm going to change the font color to white, and I'm also going to give it a bottom border underline. And when the macro is finished, I want the cursor to end up in cell A5. So that's basically what I want the macro to do. You can see there, to do that, it's taking me 7 or 8 clicks of the mouse, different steps I have to do. So I can become a lot more efficient by creating a macro, which I just click once, and it does the entire thing for me. So let's backtrack and record this as a macro. I'm going to clear everything I have in row 1. I'm going to go up to my Developer tab, and I'm going to click Record Macro. And what you'll get when you click that button is it's going to ask you to give your macro a name to make it easily identifiable. So I'm going to give my macro a name. I'm going to call this report underscore heading. And it's really important when you are naming your macros that you don't have any spaces in there. So you want to make sure it's all one word, or you separate with underscores. What you can then do is you can assign a shortcut key to make it even quicker to execute that macro. Now, I will say with shortcut keys, you need to be a little bit careful here because you don't want to assign a macro to a shortcut key that's already in use in Excel. So don't assign a shortcut key like Control-C or Control-X or something like that. Excel will prompt you if you've used one that's already in use, but I tend to like to add in Shift because I find that most of the Control plus a letter shortcuts are already taken. So let's try Control-Shift-H, see if that works. I can then choose where I want to store this macro. And again, this is a really important point. If I choose to store this macro in this workbook, then it means that the macro is basically going to travel with this workbook. So if I was to send this workbook to Adam, for example, he will be able to run the macro because it's stored in the workbook and make changes to that macro. If I open a brand new workbook, I'm not going to have access to that macro because I've only stored it in this particular workbook. If I want macros that are available across all of my Excel workbooks, I would need to save it in my personal macro workbook. Okay, so that's the difference. That will make the macro available across all of the workbooks that you create. Now, in this example, I'm just going to stick with this workbook, and it's always good to add in a description so that other people who might be looking at these macros have an idea as to what this is going to do. So I'm going to add a quick description that says format the heading of the report, something short like that. As soon as I click OK here, I'm essentially recording my macro. So let's click on OK. What you'll notice is that on that developer tab in the code group, I now have a stop recording button because I'm actually recording a macro. Now, when it comes to recording macros, you don't have to worry about time lapse. So for example, I'm sitting here currently not really doing anything. The macro isn't recording the time lapse. It will only really start recording as I start clicking around on the screen. So don't worry if you start the macro and then you go off to get a coffee and come back 5 minutes later. You're not going to have a gap of 5 minutes in your macro when you run it. It's just going to start from when you click. So let's now go in and let's execute those different steps, what we want this macro to do. Well, I want it to start in cell A1, so I'm going to give cell A1 another little click. I'm then going to type in my title. So this was weekly overview report by department. I want to select row 1 up to home. I'm going to apply a different font. We're going to make it bigger. We're going to give it a blue background, change the font color to white, and give it a bottom border. And at this point, this is where you have to be careful when you're recording a macro. If I stop recording the macro now, when I run it again, I'm going to end with that first row selected as it is now. So it's always important that when you finish basically running your steps, you click your mouse somewhere else where you want your mouse to end. So I'm going to click in cell A4 so that first row isn't selected. That's all I need this macro to do. So now I can stop recording. So let's go back up to developer and click stop recording. Once you've created a macro, they get stored underneath this macros button at the top here. And again, we have a shortcut for that of Alt F8. Let's click it, and there is my macro. And as you create more and more macros in this workbook, you're going to see them listed down here. Now, if you want to, if you've got lots of different workbooks open and they've all got different macros in them, you can view the macros in all of your open workbooks. Or if that's starting to get a bit confusing, you can just view the macros that you have in this specific workbook. You'll also see from here, this is where I can run my macro from as well. So if I want to rerun these steps, I can just click on Run, or I can use whatever keyboard shortcut I've assigned to that macro. I also have buttons here which allow me to step into it, make changes, things like that. So that is where the macro is stored. Let's see if it works. Let's test it out. So I'm going to click on the Report tab at the bottom, and I'm going to test out my macro. Now I could use my keyboard shortcut, or I could jump into Macros and I could click on Run. And there we go. It executes all of those steps, and you can see where my cursor has ended up in cell A4 because that's where the macro ended. Okay, so a very quick example of how easy it is to create your own macro. Now, something that I find that really confuses people, particularly when they're first learning macros, is this concept of absolute versus relative referencing in the context of macros. You might be used to that terminology in things like formulas, but maybe not so when it comes to macros. So let me show you what I mean. Now, by default, when you create a macro, Excel uses absolute referencing. So if I tell the macro I want to start in cell A1, it's always going to start that macro in A1. It's locked to that cell. If I tell the macro I want to finish in cell A4, it's always going to end in A4. So if I decide that I want to run this macro further down this worksheet, so maybe I want this heading to appear in row 20, I might think to myself, okay, well, let's click in cell A20 and rerun this macro. So let's go to macros and click run. It doesn't work, okay? It doesn't rerun it where I'm clicked because it uses absolute referencing and it's locked to those specific cells. So people get a bit confused about that, but you can use relative referencing when it comes to macros. And you can probably see in the code group just here on the developer tab, there is a use relative references button. If we click on that, it means that we can basically run the macro in any part of the worksheet. Now, I just want to take a break here for a second, just a little interlude in case there are people on the call today who are a bit confused about even absolute and relative references in terms of formulas. So just to illustrate this point a little bit more about fixed references, let me just very quickly show you how absolute and relative works in terms of formulas. So if I had some numbers in my worksheet, let's just say I've got a few there, and let's just add some in here, like that, and maybe I want to add these up. I could do a simple sum calculation. I can select my cells, I can close the bracket, and I can hit enter. And then what I can do to make my life easier is drag the formula down, and everything works nicely because Excel uses relative referencing by default. And what we mean by that is that as I move the formula down, Excel moves those cell references down, so it's always correct. That is relative referencing. Absolute referencing, when it comes to formulas, is slightly different. If I had maybe something like a tax rate over here of 15%, and I want to do a quick sum calculation and work out what 15% is of whatever is in D10, I can do D10 multiplied by K9. Now, if I was just to use relative reference in here and drag this formula down, it's going to be okay when I drag it down for this cell here, D11, but this reference is also going to move down one cell, so it will be referring to a blank cell. So in this case, we have to lock it to cell K9 by pressing the F4 key to make it relative. Oops, what have I done there? Let's do that again. F4, close the bracket. And that means it's now absolute and it's always going to refer to that specific cell. Okay, so that is absolute versus relative in terms of formulas, in case you weren't aware. A similar thing happens when we're using macros. So let's see an example of relative referencing in action. What I'm going to do is I'm going to type out the sales teams and how much revenue they've generated. Now, before I record the macro, I'm going to make sure I turn on Use Relative Referencing. Let's click Record Macro. I'm going to give my macro a name, so let's call this sales underscore figures. I could assign it a keyboard shortcut. I'm not, just to save a little bit of time. I'm going to store it in this workbook. And again, I'm not going to give it a description to save a bit of time, but I definitely recommend that you do that. When I click on OK, I'm now recording my macro. So what do I want to do here? Well, we want to type in sales team 1, sales team 2, sales team 3, sales team 4, and then I want to have the revenue generated. So let's just say 4,000, 5,000, 6,000, 7,000. And maybe I also want to apply some currency formatting to these figures. And then I want the macro to end in cell A4. Let's stop recording our macro. Click on macros. There it is, the sales figures macro. So now let's try running this. I'm going to go across to my reports. I'm going to click in cell A5. I'm going to go to macros and run the macro, and it adds those sales figures in. If I click somewhere else on the worksheet and again run the macro, it works over here as well. So it's not locking it to one specific location. I can basically use this macro in any part of the worksheet. Okay, so that is the advantage of using relative referencing. Hopefully that makes sense to everybody. All right, so now we kind of understand that concept. Let's move on to creating a little bit more of a complex macro, which basically involves us performing lots of different tasks. So I'm going to close down this worksheet and I'm going to open up, let's open up, which one do I want? Complex macros. Okay. Now with this one here, what I've done is I've actually written out what I want to do in a little instruction box on the side. Now you don't have to do that, but I would recommend if you plan on recording a macro that contains a lot of steps, so maybe it's a very complex macro, I would advise that you do kind of make a note of the different steps before you record the macro, because there's nothing worse than kind of getting partway through the recording of your macro and then maybe forgetting where a specific command is and hunting through all the ribbons, maybe clicking on the wrong thing. You don't want all of that recorded in your macro, so make sure that you're kind of fairly set on where you need to click prior to recording. So just to remind myself, I've put a little instruction box up there. Another thing that is so important when you are recording macros is that I would always advise that you make a backup copy of your worksheet. So for example, you can see at the bottom here, I have complex macros and complex macro 2. And some cases I will always make a third copy as well, because what you'll find is that when you run your macro, you can't easily back out of it. So if you've made a mistake with your macro and it goes a bit wrong, you can't click the undo button to come out of that macro. You can't undo it. So I like to make sure I have a couple of copies of my worksheet in its original form so that if everything does go a little bit wrong when I run the macro, I always have backup copies. So I'm going to take 2 backup copies just to be on the safe side. Now let's take a look at what we want this macro to do. The first thing I want it to do is I want it to split up the customer name into 2 different columns, so first name and last name. Then I want it to remove the 3 zeros from the front of the order number. I then want it to remove the hyperlinks from the email addresses, and then I want it to only show the last 4 digits of the credit card number, and I want the rest of the credit card number to be in asterisks. And yes, I know all of the credit card numbers are exactly the same number. I only noticed that just before I did this session, so don't worry too much about that. We're just going to change the formatting of them. And then the final thing I want to do here is I want to auto fit the entire table to the column width. So I have a few different steps that I want to record in my macro. So let's jump up to the Developer tab. And if I want to use this again, I can use relative references if I want to do exactly this process on another set of data. So let's turn that on. Why not? Let's click Record Macro and give our macro a name. So I'm going to call this Format Customer Table. I could give my macro a keyboard shortcut, so something like Control-Shift-T. I'm going to store it in this workbook, and I would probably, normally, outside of a webinar, give this a description. Click on OK, and I am now into recording my macro. So what's the first thing we need to do here? We want to split up the customer name into 2 columns, first name and last name. So I'm going to insert a new column. I'm going to select all of the names and I'm going to use text to columns. I have delimited data and my data or the names are separated with a space. And you can see just underneath how it's going to split those names at the space in between the names. Click on Finish and it splits them up. I can now just rename or type in a name for these headings. So we want first name and last name. That is task 1 complete. The next thing I want to do is I want to remove the 3 zeros from this order number. And to do that, I'm going to use the Flash Fill utility in Excel. So once again, I'm going to insert a new column. And with Flash Fill, all you need to do is basically type what you want to keep. So I want to keep the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then I'm going to use the Flash Fill button in the Data Tools group to fill the rest of those down for me. What I can then do is just copy these and paste them over the top, and I'm going to do a paste special to paste just the values. And then I can delete that column. The next thing we need to do is remove the hyperlinks from the email addresses. So this is a fairly straightforward process of selecting the cells, right-click the mouse, and at the bottom, remove hyperlinks. And then the final thing I want to do here is I want to only show the last 4 digits of the credit card number, and I want everything else to appear in asterisks. Now, as I'm going through this, I'm not particularly too worried about you understanding exactly all of the different techniques I'm using in Excel. This is really just to show you an example of a more complex macro. So the final thing I want to do here is just show these last 4 digits. So I'm going to use a little bit of a formula. We're going to type in equals, and in quote marks, I'm going to say I want asterisk, asterisk, dash, dash. And then we're going to basically concatenate using the right function, text in cell F6, and I want to pull out the last 4 characters. And that should give me the format that I'm looking for these credit card numbers. I can then Control-C to copy that, and I'm going to paste it over the top so that I get the correct credit card number values, and I can then delete that column. The final thing I want to record in my macro is just to auto-fit the entire table. So I'm going to select the entire table, go up to Format, and I'm going to say Auto-Fit Column Width. And that is it. And remember, where do you want your mouse to end up? Well, I'm going to say I want my macro to end in cell A2. So now I can go up to Developer and say Stop Recording. And that is my macro recorded. So now we can test it out and see if it works. So everybody keep your fingers crossed, because one false move, and you never know with these, they can go completely wrong. But let's give it a go. I'm going to click on macros. There is my macro. I've switched across to the copy. So this is what it looked like originally. So now you should see this change with all of those formatting changes. Let's click on Run. Quick as a flash, it went through, and now we have all of that data formatted. So imagine if this set of tasks was something you had to do frequently, how much time that takes compared to doing it once and recording it as a macro and then just being able to rerun it. It makes your life a lot more efficient and a lot easier. Okay, let's close this down and let's take a look at another example. Now this time we are going to assign a macro or a few macros to some buttons or form controls in this case. And the first thing I'm going to do here with this table of data is I'm just going to add some filters onto the top. Now, the cool thing with macros is that you can assign them to different things. So for example, you can assign a macro to a shape, you can assign it to an icon, a picture, a form control, anything like that. So if I want to make this worksheet really interactive and easy for people to understand, instead of them having to go in and mess around trying to run macros from the Developer tab, I could just create a very simple little button that says Filter by HR Department. And I can attach a macro to that, which is going to execute those steps. So let me show you how that works. I'm going to create 3 buttons at the top here. The first button is going to sort this data by department, A to Z, and then by hire date, newest to oldest. I'm going to create a second button that is going to filter this list so that I can only see people in the HR team. And then the third button I'm going to create is going to be a button that clears any filters that I've applied to this data. So I want to create 3 different buttons, so that requires 3 different macros. So let's jump up to the Developer tab and click on Record Macro. I'm going to give my first macro a name, and this one is going to be the macro that sorts by department and hire date. So I'm going to call it Sort by Department Hire. I could assign a shortcut. I'm not going to do that for just to make things a little bit quicker, and click on OK. Now I'm recording my macro. Let's run through those steps. I'm going to go to the Data tab. We're going to click on Sort. I'm going to say I want to sort by the department, A to Z, and then by the hire date, but I want to sort it by newest to oldest, and click on OK. That is the first macro. So let's jump up to Developer and click Stop Recording. Let's record our second macro. Straight back into Record Macro. This time I want a macro that's going to filter by the HR department, and click on OK. So now I just need to click the filter drop down. I'm going to deselect everything, select HR, and click on OK. And that is the end of this macro. Stop recording. The final macro I want to record is a macro that's basically going to clear any filters that I've applied and reset this back to how it was originally. So once again, we're going to record macro, and this macro is going to be called Clear Filters, and click on OK. So for this one, we just need to go to the Data tab, and I'm going to say Clear. Very straightforward macro. Stop recording. So now if I open up the macros pane, you can see all three of those macros that I've created. Now that I have them there, I can basically create buttons and assign macros to those buttons. Now, when it comes to creating little buttons on your worksheet, as I said, there are a few different ways you could do it. You might want to use something like a shape. So I could grab a little rounded rectangle and maybe draw a little button up here, add some text, change the color, whatever I want to do. And if I want to assign a macro to make this a clickable button, all I need to do is right click and I have an assign macro option just here. And I can go in and choose which macro I want to execute when this button is clicked. Now, I'm not going to do it for a shape. You could also assign macros to things like icons. So if you want to make this a little bit more interesting to look at, you can select an icon from the gallery. And if you right click, you can assign a macro from the contextual menu in there as well. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use form controls to create some buttons. And again, you'll find form controls on the Developer tab. They're in this controls group. If we click the insert drop down, I'm going to choose this first one here, which is a button form control. And I'm just going to draw this little button up the top there. And straight away, it asks me to assign a macro. So I'm going to assign the sort by sort by department and hire date. Click on OK. I can then rename my button. Sort by department and hire date. Let's create another button. And again, you can take a lot more time than I am creating these and making them look nice, but I'm going to assign this filter by HR department macro. I'm going to give this a name as well. So a filter by HR department. And I'm going to move that. Whoops. These are sometimes a little bit tricky to move. There we go. And move that across there. And then the final one we're going to create is just going to be one that clears all of the filters. So this can be a smaller one, clear filters. And once again, we can just call that clear all, something like that. And again, I'm just going to move that across. So now that we have our buttons, let's see them in action. Now I'm just going to mess up this data a little bit. Let's reorder this in a slightly different way. So now, if I click on my first button, it sorts it by department and then by hire date. I can then filter by the HR department, and then I can clear all to take it back to how it was. So that's an example of how you can combine macros with buttons to make something that's really interactive and easy for people to use. So now we have all of that in mind. We've seen a few examples of how we can create macros and how we can record them. The final point I really want to cover here in relation to macros is saving your worksheets. Now you'll notice that all these macros that I've created, I'm working in a workbook that it just has the file extension .xlsx. Now you'll find that if I go to save this, I've actually purposely turned off autosave so it didn't keep popping up a message. But if I go to save this, it's going to recognize that I now have macros stored in this workbook, and it's going to ask me to save this file as a macro enabled workbook. So that's something you must always do. If you do have macros in your workbook, you're going to need to save it and just go down to File, Save as a different file type. So where it says Save as Type, you're going to need to save it as this, a .xlsm, a macro-enabled workbook. And what this will essentially do is if you were to send this to somebody else, depending on the settings that they have in relation to macros, it's going to prompt them. So when they open up the workbook, it's going to tell them that the workbook contains macros, and they're going to get a choice as to if they want to continue opening it, because sometimes it has been known in the past that malicious code has sometimes been delivered and passed around using macro code. So now we have these little warning signs come up asking us if we're okay to proceed. Okay, so just remember the different file type you need to save in if you have macros in your workbook. Now we have about 10 minutes left, and just to finish off, I just want to focus a bit more on that VBA editor. So what we're going to do is we're going to jump back in and open up the VBA editor window that we were looking at earlier. Now, if you remember, the keyboard shortcut to quickly open it up is Alt plus F11, or alternatively, from the Developer tab, you can just click the big old Visual Basic button at the side there. And I'm just going to display these side by side so that we can see them easily. Now let's take a closer look at what we're looking at just here. So again, in this project window, you can see at the top, it's telling me that I have the Sort and Filter macro workbook open. It's then showing me the different sheets. I only have one sheet, and that sheet is called Sort and Filter. And then, of course, because I've got macros contained in here, I have a modules folder. And if I double click on module 1, this is the code for these 3 macros that I created. So you can see at the top here, there is my sort by department, there is my filter macro, and at the bottom, there is my clear filters macro. And once again, I could go in and using the properties window at the bottom, I could give this a more meaningful name. So I might want to say sort. I'm going to use underscore sort and filter macros, just so I know what they are. Now, the thing I want to focus on in this particular section is I just want to go back to taking a quick look at this immediate window at the bottom, because there are a couple of different things you can do in here. And if you start working quite frequently in this Visual Basic window, then the immediate window can be quite useful. Now, there are so many different uses for this immediate window, and I would encourage you to look up more information on this online if it's of interest to you. But basically, what you can do down here is you can ask the immediate window questions. So, for example, if I want to maybe find out how many worksheets I have in this workbook, I can ask the immediate window. And if you want to ask the immediate window a question, you put a question mark at the front there. And what I can say is if I wanted to count the worksheets, if I type in worksheets, dot, you can see I then get some choices. I'm going to say count, like so. And when I hit enter, it tells me that I have 1 worksheet. If I want to find out, maybe I'm clicked on, let's say cell E8. If I want to find out what the number formatting is of the cell I'm currently clicked on, I could say, okay, let's ask it a question. I'm going to type in active cell dot, and then I can say, what's the number format? And it's going to show me. What if I'm clicked on a cell that contains text? Well, if I rerun this, if I type the same question in again, active cell dot number format, and hit enter, it's telling me I have general formatting applied. What if I want to find out what's actually in a cell? Well, I could say, okay, question, range, open bracket, tell me what is in cell A7. Close the bracket, hit enter, and it's giving me the value in cell A7. So you can ask it questions like that. Obviously, we've just barely scratched the surface. There are so many different things you can do with it, but hopefully that gives you kind of an idea of some of the things you can ask. Another use for this immediate window is that it allows you to essentially run pieces of code, maybe practice pieces of code prior to adding them into your main macro at the top. If you want to edit your macros, you might want to try out a piece of code prior to actually adding it into your macro code. So you can do things like that down here in the immediate window as well. And just to give you an example of that, if I decided that I wanted to have all of these headings centered, I could test out the piece of VBA code. Now, again, I don't expect you to remember this, but just so you can see how this works, what I could do is type in selection, because I have some cells selected. I could say horizontal alignment equals Excel center across selection. And you'll see when I execute that piece of code, it's going to align all of those into the center of the cell. So I know that that bit of code is working. I might then want to transfer it up into the window above and apply it or add it into my macros. So another really good place where you can test out code. So with all of that said, let's take a look at the VBA editor a little bit closer whilst we run a macro. So I'm going to close down this worksheet and we're going to open up this final worksheet just here. And this is the final little exercise that we're going to do before we finish up. Now, what I have here is I just have again some data, and maybe this is a little report of software sales, and I have to send this report to 2 different clients. And maybe one client likes the report to be formatted in Segoe UI font. And maybe the other client prefers this report to be formatted in Lato font. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create 2 macros that switches between those fonts depending on which client I'm sending this to. So what we're going to do is we're going to open up the VBA window again so you can see what happens as we record a macro. So let's jump into Visual Basic, and I'm going to arrange these windows so that they're side by side. Now what you'll notice here is, again, in this VBA project window at the top, it's telling me that I'm in the change font workbook, which I am. I have one sheet, which is the sales sheet. Now you can see that I don't have a folder called modules because I don't have any macros recorded yet. That modules folder gets automatically created when you start creating a macro, and you'll see it appearing here as I start to run one. Now, for the time being, I don't need the immediate window, so I'm just going to close that down and give myself a little bit more space. So what we're going to do is we're going to record the first macro, which is going to change all of the font on this worksheet to Segoe UI, and we're also going to make these subtotals and headings bold. So on the Developer tab, let's go to the code group, and you can see now, because my window is a bit smaller, my icons or commands have shrunk down. Record macro. I'm going to call this one change underscore font underscore Segoe UI. Again, you can do the shortcut key, all of that malarkey if you want to. I'm not going to. Click on OK. Now look in the VBA project window. Now that I'm recording, can you see a modules folder has been created? And this is where the macro code is going to go into. So let me run through my macro recording. I want to select the entire worksheet. I then want to go to the Home tab, and I want to change to Segoe UI font. So that should be all the way towards the bottom. Where are we? Where are we? There we are, like so. What I also want to do is I want to make these headings bold. I want to make these subtotals bold. And if we scroll down, I want to make the subtotal and the grand total bold as well. And you can see here the column isn't quite wide enough, so I'm going to widen out that column by double clicking. I'm going to scroll to the top because I want my macro to end in cell A4. Let's go to the Developer tab and stop recording the macro. Now that we've recorded that one macro, let's take a look at the code that it's created. So I'm going to expand the modules folder and double click on module 1. And there is my macro. Now let's take a quick look and read through this code, because even if you're not all that familiar or you find things like this quite daunting, you don't really have to be a programmer to kind of get an idea as to what this code is doing. Now what you'll find is when you are looking at a piece of VBA code based on a macro, the macro will have a structure. So it's always going to start with sub and then the name of the macro. And you'll also find at the bottom, it's going to have end sub, and sub just stands for subroutine. What we then have underneath is some text in green. And you'll see that there is an apostrophe at the beginning. Now, anything you see with an apostrophe at the beginning showing in green is a comment. So it's not a piece of code that runs. So if you want to add comments or notes into a macro, maybe to help other people who are editing the macro, then you can. Just make sure that you put an apostrophe in front of it so that VBA doesn't think it's a piece of code that it needs to try and run. So what I could do here is I could type in an apostrophe, and I might want to say something like, this is just for the sales team. When I click away, you'll see that that changes to green. So green are comments. What I then have is cells.select. So this line of code is basically when I selected the entire worksheet. What I then did is I changed the font to Segoe UI. So after we've selected the cells, we then change the selection font to Segoe UI. And there is that line of code. Now, what you'll notice underneath this kind of whole section just here, basically what the VBA editor does is it then runs through a whole bunch of other font properties, and it basically says, no, I don't want to turn that one on. No, 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 which is kind of seems a little bit pointless. You might as well have just left them out. But essentially, because all I've done here is change the font, I haven't asked for strike through, superscript or anything. This section of code is pretty much not needed. So I could delete this out and the macro is still going to work fine. Okay, so just be aware of that. We are going to delete these out in a moment. What we then have is after we change the font, what I then did is I started making cell selections to change the headings and the subtotals to bold. So you can see here it says range A6 to E6 select, which was this range just here. And then it says selection font bold equals true. So it's basically toggling on bold. It then says range A19 to E19, which is when I made this selection down here. And the same thing, selection font bold equals true. It then says active windows, scroll down. And that is when I scrolled down to the bottom and then selected the next cell range A32 to E33. And then again, we applied bold font. I then double clicked to widen out column E. And that is what we have just there, column E, entire column, auto fit. And then I scrolled up, so we have a scroll, and then it says range A4 select, and that is where I basically wanted the macro to end up. So even if you don't know VBA, it's fairly simple to read through this macro. And once you start understanding your macro code, you can then start making basic changes to the code. So a simple change I could make here would be instead of ending up in cell A4, maybe I want the cursor to end in cell F1. So I could simply come down to here and I'm going to change the cell reference from A4 to F1. Now, if I want to just run this piece of code, what I can do is click at the top where it says sub, and then just above on the toolbar, we have a little play button. That's just going to run that particular sub. So note, when I click play, my cursor is basically going to run the same macro, but it should end up in cell F1, which it does. And you can then go through and you can make any changes you want to different cell ranges. So fairly straightforward to make minor modifications like that. What if I wanted to run another macro? Let's hit enter. Maybe when I send this to another client, they want a different style of font. So I'm going to record another macro. I'm going to call this change underscore font underscore Lato. And click on OK. Note what's happening in the code window as I'm doing this. It's created the sub, it's given it the name, and now I can go through my different steps. So I want to select everything again. Note the code being built, cells.select. Go to the Home tab, and I'm going to change it this time to Lato font. So let's find it in the list. There it is. Keep an eye on the code window. You can see it selects it, puts all that other stuff in, and that's all I really want to do here. I don't need to change it to bold because it's already in bold, but I do want my cursor to end up in cell F1 this time. Go to developer, stop recording the macro. So you can see there how that's been built up in this code window. What I could then do is go through and start making different changes. So as I said, I don't really need the rest of these font properties. So I could delete this out. Now, I would say that when it comes to deleting things out of the code, I would always say to add an apostrophe at the front just to comment it out first. So before you delete it, this will prevent that piece of code or that line of code from actually running, so that maybe if it doesn't quite work out, you can just very simply put it back again. But I know that this works, so I'm going to delete out all of this code. And I'm going to start tidying my code up a little bit. I can grab this and I might want to move it to just here. And now that I only have one property, I don't really need to have this with statement. And I can delete this one out and just make things look a little bit tidier. I want to make sure that this still works now that I've made some changes. If I click at the beginning and click play, yes, that code still works. So I could then go through and delete out exactly the same thing for this stuff at the bottom. The final thing I want to show you before we finish up, because I am aware we're about 4 minutes over, again, a couple of other little changes we could make. Maybe I decide that instead of changing the font to bold, I also want to change it to italics. So what I could do is I could edit this code where it says selection font.bold equals true. If I maybe just want to have it in italics and not bold, I could change that to false. And I could add another line of code underneath. I'm going to copy and paste. I could say instead I want font.italic to be true. And then what I would need to do is I would need to copy that to wherever I want that to apply. So currently I've only set it for this up here, but if I also wanted that to apply down here, I would copy those 2 lines of code further down here as well. Now, just because we don't have much time, I'm just going to leave it like that. And then if I go back and run this piece of code, you can see what it does there. It's now no longer in bold, it's in italics. Okay, so hopefully that's given you a little bit of an idea as to the types of things. It's getting you used to the VBA window, types of little mini changes you can make, and how it's not particularly difficult to kind of understand what's going on. And of course, as I said, you can spend your entire life never having to go into this code. You can just run macros using the recorder. But as you get more and more advanced with macros, you'll find that you want to get your macros to start doing lots of weird and wonderful things. Sometimes that will require you to go in and start writing VBA code. So it's always a good idea to have a little bit of knowledge. Now, I know I keep saying I'm going to finish. The very final thing I want to show you is just how to make your life a lot easier by adding your macros to your quick access toolbar. So don't forget, if you've created a lot of macros, you could even set up your own macros ribbon at the top. I don't have time to show you how to do that, but another quick way of being able to execute them is you could add them to your quick access toolbar. So what I can do here is go down to more commands. I'm going to choose macros. Those are my macros, and I can add both of those across to my quick access toolbar, like so. And if I want to, I can give them a nice little icon. So let's just give them this icon, and let's give this one this icon just here. Click on OK, and now I have my macro buttons just here, and I can execute those as I please. So that just makes it a lot more efficient for you. Thank you so much for joining. I hope you all enjoyed that. I hope you all learn at least one thing that you think is going to help you. Have a great night, a great afternoon, a great morning, wherever you are, and I will see you next time. Bye, guys.
If you're not a subscriber, click down below to subscribe so you get notified about similar videos we upload. To get the files the instructor used in this tutorial and follow along, click over there. And click over there to watch more videos on YouTube from Simon Says It.